Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu
alaikum to Hamza, Dr. Imran, Nazam, and Ijaz. So the historicity of the Gospels, Matthew. So my understanding is we're going to lay everything out on the first half an hour to 45 minutes. And then we're going to start inviting Christians on via the link. So over to Hamza first.
Right. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Gospel of Matthew. Obviously, I said, but 3 years ago I was going to write a book on this, right? So this, so I'm going to be taking notes during this. Right.
There's going to be quite a few commenters on that.
Now, people have asked me why have I personally picked on the Gospel of Matthew? Now, we're doing it obviously in order, but why have I personally wanted to do a book on the Gospel of Matthew? Why is Matthew so important? Well, the reason why is most Christians believe the author of Matthew is the disciple of Jesus, Matthew. And they believe this was a disciple who was walking and talking and watching Jesus and listening to his parables and his private talks and all of these things. And he's recording everything he was hearing, and he was writing down verbatim what Jesus said. So if you want a historical record of what Jesus did or said or whatever, his miracles and his teachings, then you have, this is apparently a first-hand example of it. The other thing we find with the Gospel of Matthew is that Matthew is I mean, for me, it looks like it's a Jewish audience that is aimed at. Because if you read the Gospel of Matthew, it's always referring to the Old Testament, like it's trying to prove something. Like it's trying to say, look, this is the guy who's been already prophesied, to convince the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. So if you read the Gospel of Matthew, you can see whoever authored the Gospel of Matthew had an agenda to a Jewish audience to convince them that Jesus was the Messiah, Son of Man, who was promised in the Old Testament. So we're going to test that claim. We want to see, does the idea that this the author of Matthew was Matthew walking, talking disciple of Jesus? And we're going to look at whether or not Matthew actually did know the Old Testament, or whether he misquoted it, or whether he created prophecy that never existed, and all of these kind of things. So we're going to test that. And of course, like we did with the Gospel of Mark, we're going to look at the historicity, because when people say this is history, they're saying this is recordings of things that actually happened, recordings of things Jesus did, recordings of events that occurred. So we're going to check out whether or not they meet the test of history also, inshallah. So that's a kind of overview. So Ijaz, I'll leave it to you to see how we're going to go about doing this.
So assalamu alaikum, everyone. Hamza, that was a brilliant introduction. So briefly, we are not attempting today to deconstruct every inch of the Gospel of Matthew. We're not going to look at every verse. But what we intend to do, remember, this is not a theological discussion primarily. I do expect that some theology would come into it, but this is on the historicity of the book itself. And so we are trying not to go outside of that scope. When we speak about the Gospel of Matthew in history, we need to remember that at its start, it did not circulate with a title. We have generally 3 early papyri. One is called P103. I think it contains Matthew chapter 13, verse 55 to Matthew chapter 14, verse 5. It's full of holes because the manuscript is old, but it has about 5 verses that we can generally make out. The second is P104, so they're in sequential order. That makes it easier for someone like me to remember this information. It runs from Matthew chapter 21, verse 34 to Matthew chapter 21, verse 45. But even then, it's full of holes. We call it lacunos, just means that it has been damaged over time. May Allah reward brother, I hope that's a brother, Naeem K, for his wonderful donation. Amen. And it contains about 6 verses in total. So the very earliest manuscripts, we can probably get 11 partial verses. I would estimate around 4 verses, mostly complete. The rest are just a bit more difficult to make out. There is one manuscript supposed to be with the title, Catamathyon. It was discovered in the year 1890 by Dr. Shield. I think it's a doctor, I could be wrong. Or he could just be an archaeologist, to be honest, a dealer in antiquities. He purchased it in Luxor, Egypt, in the year 1890 to 1891. There's a difference in dating. According to his own memoirs, he dates that to the 3rd century himself. And Dr. Hunt, a famous paleographer and papyrologist, he affirms that date in the 3rd century, and he opens it up equally to be in the 4th century CE. So generally what we have is that the earliest manuscripts are very limited in the data that they can teach us. They don't give us enough information to work with. Some scholars date them between the 2nd and the 4th century. Some just say it's largely in the 3rd century itself. Matthew runs about 28 chapters. Interestingly, it has a very robust genealogy at its start, and then it goes on to an infancy narrative. And inshallah, God willing, we will look at that infancy narrative. And I'm going to put the question out there. I had a debate last year. Was it last year? Yeah, for Christmas on this topic. And the video is actually on EFDawah, where a Christian brother was like questioning me and interrogating me. He's doing his PhD at the University of Toronto. And at the end of the discussion, he affirms my point and hands the mic off to someone else. So you can check that video out on the EFDawah channel. But basically, I put the question to the Christians today: why did three magicians, the word magoi or magi, so magoi in Greek, magi in English, it means magician. Why did three sorcerers come to see Jesus at his birth? That's the question we would start off with. I would like to see the interactions of the Christians in the audience. I think that generally gives us a comprehensive overview. I want to point out here, however, that Matthew is 12 chapters more than the Gospel of Mark. And it's very word heavy. So a lot of it are the sayings of Jesus. A lot of it are sayings that would not be found otherwise in the Gospel of Mark. And so it's really dense. And I did a project not too long ago at the start of Ramadan, where I took every verse that Jesus spoke and looked at the manuscript record. And very rarely did I find a verse which was not significantly changed. So I'm looking at using some of those variants today to interact with the Christian community. Again, this is not a theological discussion, but we do look forward to seeing what the Christians can present as to its historicity. As far as I am aware, and Darren can correct me here, or Dr. Imran Nazam, I think it is specifically Papias that does mention that that the Gospel of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. As you all will know, we have no Hebrew manuscripts of the Gospel of Matthew that would tell us it is that early. Secondly, I do need to point out that other writers, specifically Irenaeus in the year 185, do mention that that Matthew is the author. So there is a large gap between what we could have known and what we know later. There are no early attestations to him being the author of the gospel. So I generally hope that summarizes the technical aspects of it. And I look forward to the crucifixion that's about to come.
There was one thing I was going to add, though, I forgot to mention, is that what percentage of Matthew is copied verbatim from Mark?
So the scholars say somewhere between 75 and 90%. Like they all differ. One of the complications with this is that, no, when they say copy, they mean word for word copy.
Yeah, verbatim. Right?
Yeah. So you did say the word verbatim. I should have recognized that you said that.
Right,
My apologies. So I got to be honest, Hamza, half the time when you speak, I ignore it because you're a Man United supporter, right? So,
yes, I know.
I know you do the same to me because I support the #1 club in the UK. Right. So, so you're making me laugh on air. Right. So generally, the Gospel of Matthew adds a lot of data. And this, as you rightly said, Brother Hamza, he rightly refers to the Old Testament a lot. But what is confusing for the author of Matthew is that he seems to, whatever he copied from the Gospel of Mark in terms of the Aramaic sayings, he either removes them when he copied it or he doesn't translate them at all. And so what happens is a lot of the sayings where Jesus does miracles, he completely leaves it out of the narrative. And what he adds on are more instances in between the incidents in the Gospel of Mark that seem to add more of a Jewish flavor to who Jesus was. So is he grounded in history? I don't think so. Why he would do that, I think there are multiple reasons for doing so. But at the introduction to the Gospel of Matthew, there's a book by Edgar J. Godspeed. He actually mentions that the Christians were confused initially because they expected that when the Messiah came, the Jewish people would be converted, whereas it seemed to be spreading like wildfire to the Gentiles, not to the Jews. And so it seems as if the author of the Gospel of Matthew wanted to convert Jews, but ended up misquoting, ended up making mistakes of citations and references.
We're going to come to that.
Yeah, we will. So I'll just stop there. The rest of you guys, inshallah, can take it.
Okay, Nazam, would you like to add anything?
I was just going to say, the Papias tradition, Basically, from what I know, most New Testament scholars don't think Papias was speaking about the Gospel of Matthew that we have today, because the description or the characteristic that he gives of Matthew is different from the Gospel of Matthew that we have today. So, Brother Ijaz already mentioned one of the reasons. For example, Papias mentions that this Gospel was written in Hebrew, whereas the Gospel of Matthew that we possess is almost certainly written in Greek. One of the reasons why we know this is, as Brother Ijaz mentioned, that about 90% of Matthew's Gospel is copied or borrowed from Mark's Gospel. And everyone agrees, including tradition, that Mark's Gospel was written in Greek. And also there's certain expressions or phrases that appear in Matthew's Gospel, which Matthew translates or explains to his Greek audience. And the third reason is also Matthew utilizes or makes use of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was done about 300 years before Christ, for the benefit of those Jews that didn't speak Hebrew and lived in diaspora, for the benefit of translators. So Matthew makes use of this Old Testament. So it seems that almost with certainty, if not 100%, that our Matthew was written in Greek, and the Papias tradition is about a different gospel. In fact, some scholars, those scholars that hold to the Q hypothesis, that there was some kind of Q document, some have thought that perhaps Papias was speaking about this Q document, which is namely a document of sayings of Jesus. And since Papias also mentions that Matthew is like a saying type gospel, that seems to fit. Q seems to fit a bit better than the Matthew that we have today. So yeah.
Can I just say something? I just pick up on just one thing. Sorry, I might have misunderstood it. So the Gospel of Mark was originally written in Greek. Is that right?
Yes.
And the original
tradition as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and the original Matthew was written in Hebrew.
Allegedly, according to Papias.
Then how is so? I'm trying to understand how is a Hebrew manuscript copied from a Greek manuscript?
No, so Papias makes the claim.
Okay.
Sorry, do you want to give the answer, Brother Nazam?
No, sorry.
Just trying to understand that. That's all.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brother Nazam.
This is it's that the gospel that Papias is describing seems to be a different gospel from the gospel we have today. So
there was two gospels of Matthew, then one in Greek, one in Hebrew, maybe
more than two. Of course, the Matthew that we have today, whoever authored it didn't title it the Gospel of Matthew.
That was added later.
It received its traditional name probably around the 2nd century, when people want to distinguish the four Gospels from one to another.
Okay.
Sorry if that's complicated.
No.
That's actually fascinating. So there's a question that comes right at the beginning, but I'm going to bring that question at the end. So just to summarize what I've understood so far, because this is really fascinating. So clearly all the Gospels we know initially were not given names because they were written anonymously. And names were attributed to these Gospels later. And what we can tell by the excellent exchange and discussion that the Brother Ijaz and Nazam have had is that even the attribution of the name is probably not referring to the same document. So when we're talking about Papias giving the name, because there's evidence as has been presented, i.e., in that he was probably referring to something that was written in Hebrew, and also the gospel that we have refers to the Septuagint, which is for non-Hebrew speakers. So obviously the two things are unlikely to be related together.
I do want to point out there's a caveat here, right? I don't mean to cut you off, Dr. Imran, but just to be clear, some people might ask the question, how can you say that the Gospel of Matthew is anonymous, but then refer to it as the Gospel of Matthew? What do the scholars say? So to be clear, it is almost universally agreed, except for some evangelical scholars, that the Gospel of Matthew, or attributed to Matthew rather, was anonymous, but it's a specific form of anonymity called homonymous authorship. So whoever wrote it likely attributed it to some apostle at the start, but that author we know is not the actual Matthew that would have been a disciple. So it's anonymous, but it's a category of anonymous known as homonymous, homo in this case meaning same. So they used a name that was already in circulation, and that is what became that tradition. In fact, inshallah, on Brother Fareed's channel, Fareed Responds, we go into an extended discussion on this, and I would actually invite everyone to look forward to his upcoming videos, inshallah.
And that would be a form of, if I don't misunderstand, a form of trying to give authority to the work that would otherwise not be there. So whoever was doing this was attributing it to someone who people would listen to, because they themselves didn't have any sort of influence or otherwise. But the question right at the beginning that was fascinating is that, as Brother Hamza said, that the Gospel of according to Matthew, as we have, is attributed to be one of the Gospels that is written by an actual disciple, possibly. That's the claim that's made. So the question that comes, and then why would, and then also, we mentioned that possibly Nazam was saying 90% of this Gospel is copied from Mark, who was not a disciple of Jesus. So the question that obviously naturally that comes to mind is, why would a potential eyewitness disciple be copying 90% of the narrative from a non-eyewitness, non-disciple? So I wonder what your answers to that might be, Brother Ijaz and Hamza and Nazam.
It's an interesting question that we could put forward, right? If Matthew was aware of the gospel according to Mark, and he chose to copy it, but he chose to make changes. So, Hamza, can it be Nazan?
I think it's coming from you, Hamza. Just
there you go. Thank you, Brother Hamza. Yeah, that Nazan from your phone is really loud. Let me tell you. So briefly, here's the question to be asked. The Gospel of Matthew, the author behind it, he borrows a lot from the Gospel according to Mark. Now, if he was inspired to do so, what would be the reason for that? In the second case, if he did copy it and there are differences, is he correcting into the system?
I think turn your mic on.
Oh, Hamza, what's going on today?
Just repeat yourself, Ijaz. I think we missed it because of the mic.
No worries. Can you guys hear me? Someone says in the comments I'm breaking up a lot.
Yeah, I think it was only at that time. You're fine.
Okay, perfect. Right. So the question must become, if the Gospel of Matthew, the author behind it, is borrowing so much from the Gospel from Mark, and he makes changes, is he correcting what Mark got wrong? Is that a possibility? In that case, you can't believe it's scripture, because then inevitably comes into the question. I hope that answers your question, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah, that does. And Nazam, what's your view on that? I was wondering what your thoughts? Why would a disciple potentially be copying 90% of their text from, or 90% of another gospel that was written by a non-disciple potentially? Why would we get that?
Well, my opinion would be is because the Gospel of Matthew wasn't written by an eyewitness, but was written by some anonymous Greek-speaking Christian who's well-educated and well-read, and wants to also give his community a gospel that they can read. So rather than just simply make a copy of Mark's gospel, he rewrites Mark's gospel, as well as includes additional material as well, and gives that to his community as a supplement or a replacement to Mark's gospel. None of the gospel writers intended their writings to be collected and to be read alongside other Christian works, but initially they were read and circulated as individual documents intended to be read alongside the Old Testament. And I would say, just like Luke, although we're not speaking about Luke, but Luke makes the claim that he's writing the definitive gospel. So too Matthew is writing the definitive gospel as what he understands to be the good news about Jesus Christ.
Yeah. We'll leave Luke alone for now, but just what I'm saying is, can you hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
So already, just a few questions. We've already unpicked the claim that the author of Matthew is a walking, talking disciple of Jesus, just with a few queries.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how the Christians, for some reason, they seem to think they have some kind of solid foundation in this. So so just already we've unpicked the idea that this is a disciple of Jesus.
SubhanAllah. So that's fascinating. So I mean that's the only reasonable explanation for a potential person who might be a disciple to be copying from a non-disciple is that they're not a disciple to start with. So we've got the attribution that's probably referring by Papias to some other gospel that's potentially in the Hebrew that we don't have access to now. We know that the gospel was copied mostly from another gospel from someone who probably definitely wouldn't have been an eyewitness, even though Matthew's claimed to be someone like that. And there's no reasonable reason why that might be. And as Brother Ijaz said very profoundly, that if the Gospel of Mark is inspired, why is Matthew copying and changing this gospel? It doesn't really. Is he correcting it, or is something was the inspiration not perfect to start with? These are more theological questions, but it's sort of not really fitting together historically in the claim that this is an eyewitness testimony from a disciple that was with Jesus.
Yeah. Because what it is, this from what we see with Matthew, it's an agenda-written gospel, and we did mention it in the last stream about Mark. So in the fig tree story, Christians don't get too excited. In the fig tree story, Jesus was hungry and he saw a fig tree in the distance, and he walked to the tree and there was no tree. And he cursed the tree, and the next day the tree was withered. Okay. In the Gospel of Matthew, he's no longer hungry. There's no, oh, he's hungry, he wants some figs. He was just walking and he's seen a fig tree. We don't know why he went for the fig tree. This time, the fig tree is not in the distance, so he didn't have to put much effort in. It's on the side of the road. And this time when he curses the tree, it withers in front of him. So it's amazing how the kind of limits that was appearing in the previous gospel in Mark, where Jesus is hungry, he has to walk distance, he's angry when he gets there, he curses that tree, the next day, and all of a sudden in Matthew we see an agenda where Jesus no longer is, like I said, having these kind of qualities, like he's getting more godlike qualities, if you like. And even the woman who touches him, where in the Gospel of Mark, the woman touches his cloak and he says, "Who touched me? Who touched me?" And the woman says this. But in the Gospel of Matthew, the same story, he knows who touched him now. So instead of asking who touched him now, his first question is, "Why did you touch me?" Point exactly. So it seems like there's some kind of evolution going on. You know, this Christology kind of flex, where Jesus' limits as a man is being removed. But anyway, that we can come into that agenda afterwards. Just something I thought I'd pick up on.
I just wanted to ask one other question, actually, as well, just so that, because you mentioned this potential other writer, so it would have been somebody who is actually potentially good at writing. And is it true to say that Matthew is one of the better written Gospels in terms of the way it's laid out and the narrative and the Greek used, or is that something that I've just heard that might not be accurate?
No, it's actually very accurate. This is actually one of the reasons why scholars think that Matthew's Gospel was written after Mark's Gospel, because Mark's Gospel is written in not like in Arab Greek, and Matthew's Greek is, and as well as Luke, is more smooth than Mark's Greek, and so it seems more likely that Matthew would use Mark and improve Mark rather than the other way around, in which, you know, Matthew would write a nice stylistic gospel, and then Mark comes later on and copies Matthew and seems to, like, you know, dilute it or not make it so great in Greek. It seems more likely that Matthew used Mark and improved the Greek or polished the Greek, as well as Luke.
Yep. Leave Luke alone.
I'll try my best.
You can't help yourself, can you? You were talking about the Gospel of John in a minute, I know you.
When you're, yeah. Another point I was just going to quickly make was also Matthew. I'm going to bring in now the letter of James. Matthew.
Can you leave the epistles alone, please?
Matthew's basically a law-abiding gospel. You have this justification of faith and works in Matthew's gospel. So there is this kind of school of thought in early Christianity where a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. So in Matthew chapter 16, for example, you have Jesus saying that the Son of Man will come and he would reward everyone according to their deeds. And this is counter different from Paul's epistles, such as Romans chapter 3, verse 21, where Paul speaks about justification by faith alone and not by works. And the New Jerome Biblical Commentary, which is like a standard Roman Catholic commentary, but is respected by all Christians because of its scholarship. They plainly admit that Matthew's Gospel contradicts Paul's letters, as well as the teaching and practicing of the church, because they say the plain reading of, for example, Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 and onwards, it's clear.
I'm going to go pray.
Okay.
Yeah, that Jesus has not come to abolish the law, and that people are judged based upon their works and deeds. And they say, like, no mainstream Christian church requires all Christians to obey all the 613 laws of the Mosaic law. And they say that there's clearly like a gap between what Matthew teaches and the teaching and practice of the church. And so they say that, like, they say it's a contradiction, but they say it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just teaches us that we should learn to be tolerant and respect difference of opinion, because here you plainly have a difference of opinion among the New Testament authors. In terms of, like, Paul thought that the law, in terms of its ritual requirements, have been abolished, whereas Matthew says we have to uphold all of the law, including the ritual commandments or even the smallest.
Okay, alhamdulillah. So from what I understand, then, not only is there not only have we raised the historical issues there, but even biblical theological issues are present as well. So what is it? It's quite surprising that people would think of it as a difference of opinion on how to achieve salvation. That seems like quite a big thing to have a difference of opinion about. I mean, what I don't understand as somebody hearing this information is, why would a disciple think that the way to achieve salvation would be different from what somebody else might think if they were with Jesus or around the time of Jesus? Was there discrepancy about how salvation would be achieved at that time?
It seems like from the New Testament writers themselves, they answer this question differently. So from Matthew's perspective, when this question is asked, what does a person have to do in order to be saved? In Matthew chapter 19, verses 17 and forward, Jesus answers by saying, if one wishes to be, I'm paraphrasing, but if one wishes to be saved, one must obey or keep all the commandments, which is a different answer from which Paul gives, for example.
Okay.
Yep.
And also Matthew has this parable about the sheep and the goat, and how people will be divided, and people will be judged based upon their merit or based upon how they behaved or what they did.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like belief in God is something that's taken for granted, and that people are rewarded accordingly to how they treated others in Matthew chapter 23.
So if we were to move the conversation along, perhaps it is we could look at some verses and some of the issues with them, inshallah.
Sure.
So one of the first issues happens in the very first chapter. I mean, we could point out the issues in the genealogy given, but that's a bit confusing. I want to quote the angry pastor who says that you need to do mathematics and a mathematician to work out the genealogies in the Bible. I think you all would know his name. I don't even have to say his name, and you know who I'm referring to.
He shall not be named, yes.
Yes, he shall not be named. It's like in Harry Potter when they can't say Voldemort's name, apparently. But it's not a one-to-one comparison. So let's begin with Matthew chapter 1 very quickly. There is the verse where the angel of the Lord, I think he comes and he speaks and he says, look, the virgin will conceive and gave birth to a son, and they will name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Now, there are two issues with this verse already. The first is that in the Hebrew, it uses the word Alma, which does not necessarily imply virgin, but a young woman. And what I have here, I'm reading from the NET translation. Under its, let me see here. Under its study note, it says, it's a quotation from Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. It is unclear whether the author is citing the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew, one of the Hebrew traditions for the Old Testament, or the LXX, which is the Greek translation of an unknown Hebrew source of the Old Testament. The use of the word Parthenos, virgin, may be due to its occurrence in the Greek translation, but it is also possible that it is the author's translation of the term Alma, or young woman. The second phrase of the quotation is modified slightly from its original context. So let's hold on here. If you're going to quote something as a prophecy, but you have to change the quote to fit the prophecy, is it still a prophecy? That's the first problem. The second problem is I am not aware of anyone within the four Gospels that does refer to Jesus as Emmanuel. I could be wrong. Brother Nazam, are we aware of anyone in the four Gospels that calls Jesus Emmanuel and he responds to that name? Because it does say, and they will name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. I do recall that there's a variant here, and that his family are the one that will call him Emmanuel. Of course, they did not do so. The other variant, which is present in the text here, is that they, that is the people, will call him Emmanuel. And frankly, we do not see that within his lifetime. So that is a bit confusing. I do want to point out as well that it does refer to Herod as a king. We spoke about that, I think, on the last stream as well. And if we continue in chapter 2, it mentions after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, which is interesting because the title we know him as is Jesus of Nazareth, not Jesus of Bethlehem. It continues, in the time of King Herod, wise men, that is the Magi or the Astrologers. Now, can someone correct me here? What is the difference between an astronomer and an astrologer? Do you guys know the difference? So an astrologer is one who looks at the stars and tries to predict the future based on the signs that they see. Kind of like what you read when you get horoscopes.
Like tarot cards, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So the funny thing is, in this story, magicians from the East, evil people who look at the stars for guidance, not astronomers, right? Astrologers, horoscope type people come and they come to Jesus and they worship him, and his mom doesn't ask any questions. I could imagine, and let me put the question out there, if Jordan had a baby, right? I'm presuming he has a wife and a kid, and some random people bring gold, bring myrrh, and I forgot that, I think it's frankincense.
Frankincense, yeah.
Right? They bring those three gifts, Jordan, and they start worshiping the baby. Are you going to be like, yeah, go right ahead, it's not a problem with me? You're going to be like, what the hell? Take the baby, go in the house, I'm calling the police.
I might take the gold though, but yeah, I don't want the worshiping.
but the reaction from the family in the New Testament is like, go right ahead. It doesn't make sense. It's not a realistic scenario. Yeah. And what is worse is that if these people had good intentions, why did they go to King Herod and tell them, where is the one who is born the King of the Jews? That is a quick way to get kids killed. And so a lot of Christians, unfortunately, they read these verses to me and they say, even the evil people knew that he was God. Well, if evil people identify him as God, do we trust the testimony of evil people? No, I don't think so. And so other people had said to me, well, Magi in this case, it just means intelligent people. But how did they find Jesus? Using a star. So it tells you what they were using. So they were reading the stars to find him. So the point is, at the end of the day, you can't really escape from that problem. You know, I can tell you right now, if it was that the birth of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was mentioned in the Quran, and it is pagans looking at the stars to predict when he was born, and then they came and they worshipped him at his birth, the first thing the missionaries would say, that is not a truth from God. We must avoid that man. But the same thing is said about Jesus of the New Testament. And the Jews were not convinced by this point. In fact, in the Old Testament, you are meant to exile and in some cases kill people who use the stars to predict the future. So why would any Jew write that in his birth narrative? A person who is familiar with this would step away and ignore that. That is why when you look at the Gospel of Mark, there is not a birth narrative. And that is how we can also tell the kind of Judaism that the author possibly had, right? It's kind of like, forgive me, brothers, but it's kind of like if someone said when Dr. Imran was born, his parents, Allah forbid this is the case, I don't think it's the case, that his parents had a meal with wine and drugs and all these things to celebrate it. And then they say they had this wine and they had these drugs to celebrate his birth because he is the king of the Muslims. We would all turn around and say, that's haram, that's not allowed. And so the Jews being given this narrative fundamentally had to reject him as the Messiah because of what the Christians narrated about Jesus. So that brings us with multiple problems here. I want, if there is a Christian that comes on the stream, to fully disavow that these Magi were sent by God. I want you to condemn that evil people worshipped Jesus at his birth. And if you say to me, because the evil people worshipped him, we should also worship him, what sense are you making? Evil people are not our guide, right? The people that Yahweh would want you to kill are not our guide. So at the end of the day, I would like to see Christians contend with this, because it is not the Muslims who have made up this narrative. If the Quran mentioned this, the first thing they would tell us, reject the Quran. So I put that to the Christian brothers and sisters in the audience. And we're not being mean, let's be clear here. We are saying these things out of love. Brother Nazam, for some reason, is staring at the screen as if he's in love with me. I think that is the case.
It's when you said astronomer, he looked up at the stars.
I can see the stars in his eyes, and that's how Egypt is romantic, right? So the point is, at the very start, we have many issues, and it's not easy to interact with these issues on a surface level.
So I think that's really fascinating because, and I think this is sort of something that I always say, interesting and fascinating, but what I find it truly fascinating is that even as a youngster, I remember being at school, being one of the shepherds in the play when the school were doing, because you know I was a good actor maybe at the time.
I think I was in a Jesus play as well.
I was one of the, I had a crown on my head.
You had a crown on your head.
I remember my cousin coming to with those huge, those huge shoulder cameras.
Yeah.
And I could be wrong, but I think I cried during the play. So even as a young child, I was like, this is fake news, guys. What are you making me do?
So this event was on camera. Is there any way of getting hold of that footage?
Nope. If my cousin gives it to you, I'm going to just remind my cousin, I know where you live, I know where you sleep on the night.
So I think that what's interesting about this is that a pagan nation somehow have been given the revelation of the birth of Jesus, which is fascinating in its own right, just that concept. And obviously to travel wherever they traveled from the east. It was a time of traveling by foot and by ship and by wherever the distance is. And that would have taken months, if not years, to reach the point of destination. So they knew well in advance then were leaving at that time. But these were people who, fire worshippers, as far as I understand, who worshipped the Magi. So they were sort of very completely pagan in their origin, even understanding of God or theology. They weren't people, as far as the Christian narrative goes, who had revelation given to them in the past. But then they come, and then they start to worship. Like you said, turn up at a birth and start worshiping Jesus, peace be upon him. And it's what's fascinating about this is why is that? Because you reminded me when you were giving the example of evil people doing something and therefore taking that as a reason to do it, of when Jesus is told that Jesus is driving demons out of people, and one of the devils says that he's using other devils to take out the bigger devils to take out the smaller devils, and Jesus gives the story about the parable about if Satan's house is divided it cannot stand, and it reminds me very much of that. So you're using something bad to demonstrate something is good. So it would be the equivalent of Jesus using a bigger demon to drive out a smaller demon. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't fit with the purity aspect of, if you're trying to bring people to the worship of the one true God, to then bring pagans to be the first manifestation of that. Why was it important for Matthew then to put this narrative in at this place, do we think? What's the reason? So we understand, obviously, with the, we shall call him Emmanuel, even though absolutely right, the name Emmanuel is never used. And that was to try and fit in with an Old Testament prophecy, even though the words had to be adjusted slightly by Matthew. That we can understand the motivation for that. But why would they put in these three magi coming, the pagans coming from afar? What was the reason for that, do you think?
There's a very good reason with it, because I think it's the Parthian Empire, or I think before it became the Sassanid Empire, I forgot the name for it. The Romans and the Persian Empire were always at war. They were at perpetual war, basically. I look at this as an attempt to convert the Persians and say, even your learned people come to Christ, so therefore you should as well. So I see this as not just targeting the Jews, but targeting the Persians as well. But more than likely than less likely, I think it's just a general call to the Gentile nations to bring them to Christ. And I can see this being useful too today. I can see, someone going to Iran today and smuggling in a Bible and saying, you see, even your forefathers knew who Christ really was. And that has some kind of emotional hold on people. But for anyone reasonable, like I said, they would say, no, this is clearly wrong. I want to mention, though, that very quickly when they come, and the word that is used, I think it's padion, or child. It could be a really young child, or it could be someone up to the age of 9. Still, you will realize that neither Jesus nor Mary or Joseph speak at this point when they find the Magi worshiping Jesus. And the question has to be, what parent would not say something at that point? And if Jesus was God, right, why does he not vocalize what you do is good? Or why does he not say this is wrong? Why does he stay silent? And that is curious, because he was not silent when they traveled to Jerusalem and he taught the teachers of the law in the temple, right? So why is he silent at this point? I think it's because they want to give silent approval, at least in this case. But just the second chapter alone is filled with so many narrative issues and historical problems. I really wish that our Christian brothers and sisters can understand what they're calling us to.
Have you guys mentioned King Herod yet?
You can go right ahead, brother. What's your name again, Darren?
Sorry, I had to disappear. The adhan was going. The salah was really loud, and I would have been on mute anyway. So I thought I was going to pray. Anyway, the King Herod narrative, the census, the idea that for some reason King Herod, not for some reason, he believed that Jesus was a threat to his kingship or whatever it may be. So he ordered the killing of all baby boys, I think 2 years and below. I believe that's right. And Mary and Joseph had to flee to Egypt to escape this persecution. So imagine this is supposed to be history being written here. Nothing in Mark about this, obviously, because we don't get the infancy narratives and such. But anyway, and then he returns from Egypt, I think after King Herod dies. And the author of Matthew says something pretty, it looks like it's profound, because he says, as the prophet said in Hosea, I shall call my son from Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question needs to be asked, first of all, does that prophecy fit to what's being said here? And the answer is no. In Hosea, it's got nothing to do with this. It's to do with the children of Israel and all sorts. But nothing to do with this, right? So the author of Matthew, it seems to be corrupting the text, or taking it out of context, butchering the text, if you like, to make it fit his narrative. But there's a bigger thing going on here. Why does Jesus have to be in Egypt, to be called from Egypt to fulfill that prophecy? When you look at it, for me personally, they're trying to make Jesus like the prophet of Deuteronomy 18:18 at this point, subliminally. Yeah, they're trying to show that just as Moses fled from Egypt, so did Jesus flee from Egypt. Just as there was a census in the time of Moses, there was a census in the time of Jesus. But here's the thing: our mate Flavius Josephus, obviously Jonathan McClatchy holds no weight with this guy, but a majority of Christian scholarship believe he's a kind of accurate historian. And he wrote a book called The Atrocities of King Herod. Yeah, I don't know the actual title of it, but he basically recorded all the atrocities King Herod committed. And he doesn't mention the census. And I've spoken to Christians about this. Why does a man who's dedicating his life to writing the history of King Herod and all the horrible things he did, why did he not write about killing these babies? And you know what response I've had? So maybe some Christians could come and defend it. They said, well, in those times, there were very small villages, so we might be talking about 2 or 3 or maybe 6 kiddies. wait a minute. The idea is a census and there's all these people and all the kiddies are all butchered and such. And all of a sudden now it's like 2 or 3. So have you guys come across this and have you heard Christians respond to it? Because for me, the idea of King Herod doing this doesn't appear to be historical. Jesus going all the way to Egypt doesn't make no sense. So what do you guys say on that King Herod flex?
Even the advice that's given to the parents when Jesus' family go to Egypt, they're told that Herod is now dead. But when they return back to Bethlehem, it's just as bad, if not worse, because Archelaus, Herod's son, is ruling in his place, and so they have to now leave Bethlehem and end up moving to a place called Nazareth. And so then like another prophecy then can be fulfilled as well in Matthew chapter 2, where it says something about he shall be called a Nazarene.
Yeah, but even this, there is no prophecy. There is no prophecy that says he'll be called the Nazarene.
Either Matthew maybe invented a prophecy, or the version of the Old Testament that he's using is different from the one that we have.
It is different.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, yeah. But yeah, the initial advice that the angel gives doesn't seem like a good advice, because the family has to now leave Bethlehem again for the second time, and that's where they end up in Nazareth. From what I understand, biblical scholars think that because Jesus was known as Jesus of Nazareth, so everyone knew he was like from a town or place called Nazareth. So how is it that Jesus could have been born in Bethlehem?
Yeah.
And so Matthew wanted to explain that kind of discrepancy, and so he has Jesus being born in Bethlehem, but eventually ending up in Nazareth.
Okay. How do they respond to the question about Josephus, who's writing about the atrocities of King Herod? Does it mention this idea of census?
Well, from my perspective, they mention that not everything historical has to be recorded by Josephus, but I'm thinking that this was a major event. I think the death of the Jews is something that Josephus would be motivated to write about because these are his people. I mean, he was a rebel leader against the Romans. The fact that he omits it is more significant than the Christian.
Yeah, but wasn't he specific? Didn't he specifically write about the atrocities of King Herod, though? Specifically,
not necessarily in the way that the Christians believe he did it.
So he didn't write a book about the atrocities of King Herod. I'm sure he did.
He wrote a book about the atrocities, but not in the way that the Christians understand it, because the date that he gives is not the date that the Christians believe in it. So it's about.
No, but this, if Josephus, what I'm saying to you is this: did Josephus write a book about King Herod and all the horrible things he did?
I believe he wrote something about that. Yes,
I believe he specifically recorded all the bad things he did. How he killed his, was it wives and sons and this and that and whatever it may be, but he left this particular thing out.
Yeah, so you would generally be correct from my recollection. Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to try and find. I'll find it. I think Imran's aware. Are you aware, Imran, or am I just making stuff up?
No, I think you're right. So there's lots of things now that have come up. So I just want to really just
underline some stuff
because Hamza popped off for the salam, mashallah, as well.
Forgive me. Sorry, guys.
No, that was Melo reward you for that.
I mean,
so we already know that the Gospels. The text that we have, the extant manuscript that we have, are all very late, and anything that's sort of even earlier than the 3rd century is sort of very partial, small documents that have only a few verses. We know that this gospel was anonymous, and we know that the way the name is attributed to this person, that this seems to be very unlikely, because when Papias refers to a text, he's likely to be referring to a Hebrew text, whereas the earliest extant manuscripts we have are in Greek. We also know that there are lots of discrepancies already within the narrative appearing. So one of the discrepancies mentioned was, we haven't gone into the genealogy aspect of it. No. One of the discrepancies that's mentioned that we were talking specifically about now is
Just one sec. So, David, you are right. You are correct.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, continue, Dr.
Alhamdulillah. So that's affirming what Brother Ijaz is saying now. Josephus wrote specifically about the atrocities that Herod conducted, and he doesn't mention the atrocities. And it would have been an atrocity to kill all the young children that were born within the last 2 years when they were gathering for a census. The families are gathering for a census. So this isn't mentioned, which is another sort of nail in the coffin against the historicity of the Gospel of Matthew. Also, we have, going backwards now, we have the three magi who are pagans who come along and worship Jesus. That's problematic theologically. That's problematic in the sense of the time it would have taken for these people to travel. Them being kings in their own right, or wise men in their own right, we would expect some writings maybe from even the Persians, or some mention even in the Persian histories of these people traveling these long distances for this great person that was going to be born, that they were going to worship. We find none of those things either. So there's lots. We have lots of things happening, and they all point towards the fact that the historicity of the Gospel of Matthew is not reliable, simply because there's nothing that's consistent, and everything seems to be added on to a gospel that was written by a non-disciple, but attributed to a person that was claimed to be a disciple. It's sort of almost backwards.
I want to ask you, I wanted to petition the room really quickly. What are the first words that Jesus speaks in the Gospel of Matthew? Do you guys know what chapter he speaks in? How far in do we have to go before he speaks? No peeking at the evidence, Dr. Imran, that's cheating.
I've got my gospel parallels here in front of me.
Right, Nazam, you seem to have an answer. What's the answer?
I'm thinking, is it the baptism scene?
Yeah. What chapter is that in?
Chapter 3.
Yep, perfect. So it's Matthew chapter 3, verse 15. Right. And why this is significant, the very first words that Jesus speaks to John the Baptist, who is, if Jesus is allegedly God, he comes to John the Baptist, tries to get baptized. John the Baptist rebuffs him. You should be baptized in me. I shouldn't be baptized in you. What does Jesus say? The word in Greek is aphes. Forgive me. The same word that you read in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us for our trespasses. It is used in the same way here. And so the very first words that God speaks in the New Testament, because Matthew's the first book in the order that we have it today, is forgive me. Can you imagine God coming to John the Baptist and saying, forgive me?
Yeah. Inshallah. Brothers, can I let you know that we do have two Christians waiting to come on?
Yeah, I think we've given them enough to chew on for now, isn't it? So let's see what they've got to say.
Yeah.
So we have...
Is any of them the lady from Turkey? Because I did promise her she could get 5 minutes.
No, I was hoping to see Mary, but I think it's two gentlemen.
It's not Raphael, is it?
I'll give you a clue with the first one.
Don't say give me a clue. I'll flip it.
So your clue is celebrity Muslims.
Oh, Canadian Catholic.
So I think we renamed him last time. Didn't we rename him Celebrity Muslim? He had a few, Canadian Muslim.
Yeah.
Is Raphael coming back?
Oh, no. Please.
One people that would challenge us, people that would tell us that they're typos.
Hi, everybody. I could see Hamza's enthusiasm right when my name appeared. But yeah, the thing is, I hate this because Ijaz is the nicest one. So I hate to be shedding his arguments first because you're the nicest one. I would rather confront Hamza than you. But I'm sorry to say there's a couple of things wrong with a lot of what you present now. Of course, I'm going off the top of my head, so you have to excuse me. I'm sure there's a lot more you said.
Just start with 1 point, though, yeah? Don't go to don't scattergun us.
Okay. All right.
1 point at a time.
Let's go. So the first complaint, if I can remember correctly, at least the one I caught, was the idea that in Matthew it says that Jesus would be called Emmanuel, right? And Brother Hamza objected that he was not called Emmanuel.
Well, I didn't object to nothing, mate.
Sorry?
I didn't object to anything.
Sorry, Ijaz. I'm so sorry. I keep confusing. Yeah, Brother Ijaz objected.
We're two different people at this point, right? That's Hamza. That's Hamza. This is Ijaz.
Right. See, I keep my eyes focused on Hamza because he's at the center of the screen. But here's the obvious problem. I would say the obvious problem, right, with Brother Ijaz's prediction is that he simply doesn't keep in mind that Emmanuel could be a title of Jesus in heaven.
It says he would be called.
I wasn't done talking. So the problem is, right, there's a couple of titles of Jesus that are used. For example, for a bunch of Christians, the title the Prince of Peace is used. And of course, Emmanuel means God is with us. And if you go to John, for example, Gospel of John, the obvious thing is, for example, it's verse 14 of the first chapter, the word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's God being with us, literally. So title is Emmanuel, even though it was not his personal name. This would be my first objection. Now, the second one, moving swiftly on.
No.
Right.
1 point at a time, so then we can rinse your point one at a time.
All right. Okay, no worries.
The Greek says to onoma auto Emmanuel.
Yes.
So what does the word onama mean?
I don't know which language you're talking about. I can speak 4, but not more than.
Well, it's the Greek Bible, right? So
I don't speak Greek, as unfortunate as that is.
But I'm just amazed that as a Christian you can speak 4 languages, but none of them is the language of your scripture. But I just want to point out, I'm trying to be nice here. His name, the word onoma means name, so his name will be called this. Now, that's what the text says. It's not what I say. So, do you disagree with what the text says? Because I'm just reading from the text.
Sure.
So, is the text wrong or am I wrong? Because I'm saying the same thing as the text.
Well, Isaiah seems to say, "Will call him Emmanuel." He will be called Emmanuel. Isaiah 7:14.
But this is the Gospel of Matthew, right?
Yes, which is a quotation of Isaiah 7:14.
Which is an incorrect quotation, but it's still a quotation nonetheless. And so when we read it from the Gospel, it says his name he will be called this name. Or no, that's the word for name. So
right. What's the problem with that name being a title?
Well, you have to be called by the name, no? It's a personal name. Why wasn't he called by that name? At least once.
He was. I gave you an example where he was, for example, in John,
Who called him Emmanuel?
The word became flesh and dwelt.
No, who called him Emmanuel?
Well, since the Gospels are written in Greek, presumably Emmanuel is a Hebrew name, right?
So nobody called him Emmanuel?
Well, presumably they did in Aramaic. Unfortunately, we do not have an Aramaic sources, right?
So sorry, what's Aramaic for Emmanuel? Oh, sorry, what's Emmanuel? What's Greek for Emmanuel?
God is with us.
Greek. God is with us is the Greek of Emmanuel.
I don't speak Greek, as I said, as unfortunate as that is.
Okay, so the point here is this. He was called Emmanuel. He wasn't called Emmanuel.
He was called Emmanuel, probably in his native language. There is several occurrences.
Probably. Okay, we're dealing with history here, mate, and we're dealing with what's in front of us. We're not interested in what may have happened or could have happened. We're talking about what we're reading. That's all. And if you want to dig into Isaiah 9:6, do you believe Jesus was the everlasting Father?
Pardon?
Do you believe Jesus was the everlasting Father?
I don't see the relevance. I was speaking about Isaiah 7:14, not 6.
No, but what he was called Emmanuel, Prince of Peace, everlasting Father. It's the same prophecy.
I do believe he's an everlasting Father, yes, to me.
Sorry?
Sure, that's one of his titles.
Jesus is the everlasting Father.
Correct. That's one of his titles from Isaiah, messianic title.
No. Forget that. Do you believe Jesus is the everlasting Father?
I do believe that's his title.
Who called him the everlasting Father?
Isaiah did.
No. Isaiah's speaking about somebody who called Jesus the everlasting Father, because you're trying to say that's the one that Isaiah's speaking about. Where was Jesus ever referred to as the everlasting Father?
Well, presumably during his life, right? Gospels aren't.
No, forget presumably. Where was he called the everlasting Father? Who thinks Jesus was the everlasting Father? Don't you think he was the Son or the Father? Who's the Son or the Father? Is Jesus the Father or the Son?
Jesus is God the Son, who is also has a paternal role with us, right?
No, is Jesus the Son or the Father?
What does that mean, right? He's God the Son, if that's what
He's God the Son. So who's God the Father?
God the Father is the first person of the Holy Trinity.
Right, so would you say God the Father is the everlasting Father?
I believe God the Father can be called an everlasting Father, and Jesus.
And you believe the Son can also be called the everlasting Father?
Well, not in the relationship with the Father, in relationship with us, yes.
And who referred to him as the everlasting Father?
Presumably people in his own name.
Don't forget presumably. We're talking about historically. Who did? You don't know.
Well, I wouldn't know, since presumably the Gospels are not tasked with recording every single interaction.
Fair enough. And just to finish off this particular prophecy you're trying to refer to, you believe Jesus was the Prince of Peace when he said he didn't come with peace, yeah?
I do believe he was always the Prince of Peace.
But he said he didn't come with peace.
Correct.
So Jesus said he didn't come with peace, yet you say he's the Prince of Peace. How does that make any sense?
Well, presumably Jesus is explaining.
Why'd you keep presuming? Jesus says, according to your scripture,
I wasn't done talking.
Listen. According to your scripture, Jesus says, "Think not, I've come with peace." Now, do you truly believe the Prince of Peace would say, "I've not come with peace"?
Well, I do believe that the Prince of Peace would also be realistic about the kind of effects, right, that this sort of
No, do you believe the Prince of Peace would first words out? Do you believe the Prince of Peace? Do you believe the Prince of Peace would say, "I've not come with peace"?
I believe that the Prince of Peace could, because the only one did, right? But I wasn't done talking. I was saying.
No. But the point here is this. We're asking a very simple question. You've referred to this prophecy, and Jesus doesn't match 3 points already. He's not the everlasting Father. He's not named Emmanuel, and nor did he claim to be the Prince of Peace. In fact, he was the antithesis, because he said, "Think not, I've come with peace. I've not come with peace, but with the sword." So Jesus actually tells you, "I've not come with peace." So how can you refer to him as the Prince of Peace when he said, "I've not come with peace"?
Well, I'm trying to explain, right? But every time I start, it seems that I'm being interrupted, right? For example, this sort of objection would be just as of course, what you're engaging in is selective quotation, because I could obviously quote another verse in John that says, "Peace be with you, peace I come to bring to you," right? If I were to quote that verse and say, "Ha, there it is, he matches it."
Say it again, sorry.
Yeah, right. So, for example, if I were to quote the Gospel of John, let me look up the exact chapter, right?
Why are you going to the Gospel of John for?
Right. Yeah. So if I were to bring several verses where Jesus talks about peace, right, and would say,
first, did Jesus say those words or not? "Think not, I've come with peace. I've not come with peace, but with the sword."
Yes,
did he say that or not?
Of course he did.
Right.
But the whole purpose of those things is the paradox, right? That even the Prince of Peace is saying, "I have not come with peace." That is the paradoxical nature that you're not letting me explain.
All right. Bring your next point. Honestly.
Right. So next point that I can recall from my top of my head is, of course, Brother Ijaz. I would say quite weak point, and please don't take this as an offense, Brother Ijaz, because I do think you're a respectable person. I'm just saying I thought the point was weak about the astrologers, right? Of course, conveniently forgetting to mention that the fields of astrology and astronomy were undivided for the first 1,500 years, right? Or sorry, even more, right? Astronomers and astrologists, this was the same. The division virtually began with modern science, and that's the same with alchemy and chemistry. So in ancient times, saying someone is an astrologer or an astronomer, right, there is no difference. The same way that you could say, for example, Isaac practiced alchemy, and that could be simply that he made, for example, breakthroughs in chemistry. There was no difference between the two. That's one thing that I believe you forgot to mention.
Okay, so I didn't forget to mention anything because I specified that in the Old Testament, those people were either to be exiled or killed. So what did Yahweh command in the Old Testament that should be done to those people? What was his
those who use divination, right?
So were they not divinating using the stars?
Well, not if God revealed it to them. Because that would be the exact opposite of why.
How do you know that God revealed it to them?
I wasn't done talking, right? So the whole purpose in Matthew is that God reveals these. God is the one revealing the star. So that's the exact opposite of why the people in the Old Testament are to be exiled.
So just to be clear,
like your point is not only incorrect; it is incorrect. It can't be more incorrect. At least the way. And again, don't take this as an insult. You know I'm a respectful person, right? At least you're okay.
Okay, Canadian, just work with me for 1 second.
Yeah.
So when Yahweh gave the laws in the Old Testament, did he say if they claim that I reveal the star to them, it's okay not to kill them?
I don't know what that means. Yahweh commands them, right, to be exiled as long as they use divination, which is going against God. There is nothing against the idea that God can reveal his message in dreams. But you remember, for example, that even those who use dreams, the magicians who use dreams, should be exiled as well. But later on, we see God revealing things in dreams. I think even Muslims agree with that. This is the same principle that follows. Using stars for divination against God's will is a sin. That does not preclude God from being able to reveal his message in the stars.
Okay, so just quickly, 1 second. So theoretically, if I was in Israel in the first century and I said, all right, guys, Yahweh told me that this is going to happen in the future, then they have no right to kill me, right? Or to exile me.
Of course not, unless you're a false prophet, which would probably be the case.
No, I'm asking you that question.
No, you wouldn't be exiled if God revealed his message to you.
So how do you know that God revealed that to me by me just claiming it?
Oh, that's why there are criteria given for how to identify a false prophet in the same Torah. Presumably.
All right. So I can use the stars and it's fine as long as I believe that God told me that this is the information, yes?
Oh, as long as you do not use divination.
Okay, so perfect. In the verses in the Old Testament, can you go to them and read for me where that exception is given?
That God can reveal things?
No, that God says, if I am the one that tells you to look at the stars, it's fine.
No, by definition, that would not be divination. So I don't understand what the exception would be about, right?
So who is the person claiming that God revealed it to these wise people?
The only person who records it, Matthew.
So did those wise people know that God revealed it to them?
Yes, that's the morale of the story.
No, do they say that of their own will?
Apologies, I couldn't hear you.
Did they say for themselves that they believed God revealed it to them?
Well, presumably they treated it as a fact, right? It was a fact.
Keep presuming. Everything you've said are presumably.
Well, I'm not infallible, right?
We know
No,
that
but
you're not
everything you've said,
infallible.
everything you've tried to support,
One
you've started with the word
second.
presumably, which means you don't know.
One
You're
second,
guessing.
Darren. So the point I'm trying to get at here is you're telling me I'm wrong because the wise people knew it was from God, but they gave no indication of that. In fact,
Well, no.
Let me finish. I'm speaking. I'm talking. Right? I'm doing what you do. Right? I'm quoting your words for you now. So I'm trying to be nice to you because I don't want to badger you as an individual. But I want you to make this point clear for everyone who's listening. Right? So in the Old Testament, when God said astronomers kick them out and kill them, did he give exceptions in that same text? It's a yes or no question.
No, the question is incorrectly phrased, right?
No, you got to answer the question. Did he himself give exceptions to that rule?
No, there is no exception. Divination is always wrong.
It's always wrong. Okay, brilliant. Now, you believe that if it's from the wrong God, it's wrong. If it's from the right God, it's right. So
if it's from the right God, it's not divination by definition.
I accept that. But do those people know that it was not divination?
Yes, because God revealed it to them, and presumably God can reveal something with certainty.
Right. So God revealed it to them. Did they know that God revealed it to them? And how do you know what was in their minds?
Because that's the morale of the story.
The moral of the story is that they brought attention down on Jesus and they got a bunch of people killed, and they didn't even warn the family that Herod is coming with his. Let me finish speaking. I'm talking. Right. So he didn't even warn them. An angel of the Lord had to appear to Joseph to warn them. So they invited trouble. They got innocent people killed, and God revealed that. So just to be clear, God wanted those babies to die because he raised the star in the sky.
I don't see the relevance, right?
No, but you told me the moral relevance of it is that God revealed that star and God wanted those people to come. So they came and they got babies killed. So will you agree here and now that those babies deserved to die because God put that star in the sky? Is that your affirmation?
No, I don't see what the point is, right?
You don't have to see the point. It's a simple question. Did God want those babies to die because he put that star in the sky?
I don't know if God wanted babies to die.
But God would know that if those people came from the east and went to King Herod and told them about the star in the sky, that those babies would die. And you said yourself, it's not divination because God put the star in the sky. So God wanted those children to die.
Topic, right?
It's the same topic. It's the same. No, I'm talking. I'm talking. I'm not finished. I'm talking. Remember, Canadian, you have the problem now where you're telling me it's fine if it's divination because God allows it, but you're not comfortable with the consequences of God's revelation of that star. So you seem to be of two minds rather than of one. So please follow through the logic and convince me that that star in the sky was not evil. Convince me that the killing of those children was not evil. Convince me that the wise people who knew that if they challenged that Herod was the king, whoever they challenged Herod to be the king with would be in trouble. So they invited trouble upon Joseph, upon Mary, and the child or the baby Jesus. How is that something to celebrate?
Right. So I hope I let you talk, right? So now please give me like at least a minute, right? So the thing is, right, first of all, of course, it seems like you're missing that even God at the end, the last time you see the Magi, right, warns the Magi what path to take. And obviously, the morale of the story, not morality, moral of the story, as in the point of the story, is that they were from God, and this was a sign from God. That's point one, right? Because that's how it ends. God actually sent them a star and then took care of them to the end. That's indicating that at least in the Gospel of Matthew, the moral of the story, and the meaning of the story is that they were from God. Secondly, of course, we moved into the the problem of theodicy. And this is the same problem, right? The thing is that Herod is not absolved for being an evil individual. We cannot victim blame that, you know what, people came to worship Jesus and because of it people died. No, those babies died because Herod was an evil individual. And the only person to be blamed for those babies dying is Herod and no one else, right? So this is the moral of the story. The moral of the story is that God revealed a sign to even the most well-known astronomers of the time, right, who came to worship him. Because of this, there was a jealous king who got up and murdered kids. And blame for the murdering of the kids lies only and solely. And final point.
So hold on.
Final point. I wanted to make this point again. You seem to say that there's divination with exceptions. Well, what I want to make clear is, if something is revealed by God, by definition, it's not divination, right? The divination is only and solely when God doesn't reveal and you go into something using your own methods. That's divination. If something is revealed by God, by definition, it's not divination. Can we agree on this?
Yeah, but he just
let's
asked
work
you.
step by step.
He
And
just
I'm going
asked
to do
you the
this slow.
question. Yeah.
Right, so hold on. I'll work with him step by step. So in the Old Testament, does Yahweh permit divination?
No.
Does he permit reading the stars to come across true knowledge about him?
No.
Okay, did the Magi say themselves that they believed in Yahweh?
Presumably they did, since they came to worship him.
But they say that we have the gospel that we're reading from, right? So I don't want to presume, because I could presume that they didn't believe because they didn't say that one way or the other. And you would tell me, Ijaz, you can't read your view into the text. So I'm begging you, don't commit eisegesis and put words on the mouth of those people. So they came, let's be clear here. If they were good people, did they not understand that going, because they're supposed to be wise people, right? Did they not think going to an evil king who committed many atrocities and telling them, hey, there's someone that's going to rival you and he's a baby, would not cause death and destruction?
Well, presumably they didn't know that, since they had to be warned not to go through the same way, right?
So there's a reason I asked you the question. Do you want to know why? In that same chapter, it cites a prophecy from Micah 5, chapter 2, where there promises to be lamentation and weeping because the children would be killed. So you just said to me that God was not wanting that to happen, but the text itself says that. So you've contradicted yourself. You've made God the agent of that.
God knew that it would happen.
Please don't be rude. I'm talking. So it contradicts you. God wanted those children to die. Can you say amen? That's a prophecy fulfilled. Can you say amen?
No.
Can you say hallelujah? That's a prophecy fulfilled. Hallelujah. Come on. Let me hear it at least once.
If I could just for one moment, Catholic Ray, thank you very much for raising your points. We appreciate your time and that you've given. I'm just going to, the thing that I was just listening because I was really trying to see what points you were bringing. And I think the only two, this is what I saw, and maybe I'm caricaturizing you in a false way, so apologies if that's the case. But essentially for the Emmanuel point, you said that you ignored the fact that it was a name, and you said that this is possibly a title. But then you said that presumably somebody called him by this.
Right.
And then you gave the same answer for the Magi. You said that presumably they were given revelation by Yahweh, which is the only way to get around the problem of the divination of the stars being something that Yahweh prohibited in the Old Testament. And then so you're using the word. So what you're doing, you seem to be basing your case upon conjecture rather than saying, if you look at this verse, this explains it. Or here is where it says Emmanuel is a title. Or here it is where the Yahweh says that He has revealed to the Magi this prophecy about a son being born and to follow the star. No, we don't find any of those. So although I appreciate the attempt at trying to find an alternative narrative, we can't, when we're trying to do historicity, we can't really go with presumptions that seem to be just designed to get out of clearing problems.
Inshallah. Just to let you guys know, we do have 3 other people waiting. So I think
if I could get Nazam's view, if that's all right, on this very specifically before you go, Canadian Catholic.
No, it's fine. I thank you for your time.
No, thank you, Canadian. I hope you weren't offended.
Not in the slightest. I've spoken with Brother Ijaz on other occasions. He has been in my country. I have nothing but respect for all of you. Nothing but
I'm in the country. I'm still here. I haven't left.
Oh, okay. And nothing but respect for like Islam and Muslims. I just disagree with arguments, but not with people. And nothing
Sure.
but.
We appreciate your time, Kathleen.
No,
Welcome
thanks
back
a lot,
again
Canadian.
anytime.
I'm gonna call again. All right, take care.
Okay.
God bless.
Thank
Let's
you.
do
See you later.
Nazam, brother,
Thanks for
what's your
coming
view
on,
on
bro.
what was your view on this? Whilst we're getting the other Christian on, what was your view on the points that Canadian Catholic was putting forward? Because it seemed very much to me just conjectural rather than based in anything more evidence based.
Yeah, it was quite. I had trouble following, to be honest. I stopped at the bit about the Virgin Mary, like they should call his name Emmanuel. So I was just looking at the verse, and it was saying that Joseph had a dream, and in the dream he's told that they shall name Emmanuel.
Absolutely.
But the strange thing I found was that in the very couple of next verses, Joseph wakes up from that dream and then names him Jesus.
Jesus, yeah.
So I just found out because in the dream it says they will name him Emmanuel, but then he wakes up and then names him.
But we don't always remember our dreams, so he could be forgiven for that.
Inshallah.
But if this is a prophecy, then it seems odd because, as brother Gerald Dirk pointed out, rahmatullah alayhi, in his book, Cross and Crescent, that it seems that Matthew has taken a prophecy where, for example, Bob throws the ball and Bob catches the ball, and so Matthew sees Jacob throwing the ball and catches it, and sees this as fulfillment of prophecy, even though the two have two different names.
Yeah. Fallacy of the missing middle, isn't it? Okay.
Yeah, there seems to be a gap between what Isaiah says and what Matthew reports about Jesus.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair for that.
Like I said, there's plenty of prophecies that Matthew comes up with that we're going to rip apart, but not today.
I think we've given enough.
Yeah, there's enough to go on today.
Yeah,
because even this particular, the story of King Herod, because we've still got the verse, the prophecy from Jeremiah where it talks about Rachel weeping for her children, and Matthew's referring to the slaughter of the kids and all that. And when we look into that, we'll realize it's nothing to do with that. But again, another story. Let's not excite the Christians too much. Let them deal with what we put on their plate so far. So who's next?
Oh, wait, just 1 second. Just 1 second. So the verses are Leviticus chapter 19, verses 26 to 31. You shall not eat anything with the blood, nor shall practice divination or soothsaying. It does not say wait for them to do it. Think about what they've divinated and then kill them if it doesn't happen. It doesn't say that. I continue to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. When you enter the land which your Lord gives you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, or one who uses divination. So again, you can't even imitate it. So it's not as if you do it in the right way, it's fine. You can't do it, period. There shall not be anyone. That seems absolute to me. So I just want to point that out here. What is interesting is that you guys are right. He presumed many things, but I was just disappointed with the state of the argument. You can't presume that the teachers of the law would wait. It says, do not let anyone do this. It doesn't say wait for them to find out first and then correct them. It does not say that. So I do look forward to him following up with that claim. Yep.
But would he also be suggesting, therefore, that there were prophets outside of the Bible that are from the pagan?
Well, it seems interesting. It seems interesting that these three people come into the story, they worship Jesus and they leave. We don't know if they had any other false beliefs. We don't know if they continued being pagan. The topic is just left as it is. And what was peculiar was that he said, presumably they believed. Now, if demons can worship Jesus, because that's what happens in the Gospels, that does not mean that those three magi were sincere or even good people. They invited the wrath of Herod, and you will notice when I asked him, who is to blame for that? He said, Herod only. And then I brought up the very next verse, which was the prophecy that there must be lamentation and weeping because of Herod. So again, it's a contradiction that I don't think he realized that. I don't think he read the chapter before he came on, to be honest.
Didn't he say the word presumably 5 times?
He said it more times than James White says the word consistency.
Presumably this, presumably that, presumably this, presumably that, presumably the other.
This is
Which
just a
means basically we don't know, but we're going to guess.
It's a confirmation of the ayah that everything is just conjecture.
Completely.
Okay,
next Christian, please,
Next
Jordan.
one. So should we limit it to sort of 10 minutes per person? I mean, we are getting quite a lot of people coming in today, and some of them are leaving.
That's good.
Inshallah. So we got brother Jacob, who looks like he's prepared for the coronavirus and stuff, taking precautions.
No, mute him, Jordan. Mute him, Jordan.
Okay.
Mute him and remove him. Not this man. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, he is. This is not a person that we want on the stream, and we would probably get demonetized and banned. So skip. Next guy.
All right.
Right.
All right. So we have
next Christian, please.
So maybe that mask wasn't for the coronavirus.
No,
right.
no.
The RC Apologist we have here. Welcome to the stream, bro.
Thank you for having me on.
So you a Christian, just to make sure?
I was actually informed about this through, what was his name?
Zakir Hussain?
Yeah, Zakir Hussain. He had brought this about and mentioned Ijaz, so yeah.
Fantastic. Did you want to say your points?
I think I've seen some of your tweets online. You're engaging
Wouldn't surprise me.
Zakir Hussain on Twitter. Yeah, cool. Nice to meet you.
Likewise, nice to meet you. So I guess one of the things I would like to go over then would be the issue of the Papias statement. The issue that I would have is that it's not referring to being written within the Hebrew language, but rather the Hebrew rhetoric, as scholars such as Joseph Kurzinger, Robert Gundry, and others note, that it is referring to that it's written within a Hebrew rhetorical style and not necessarily the Hebrew language. In other words, if you look at, for example, in the comparison between Matthew and Mark, some terms that they use are different, but are referring to the same exact account. It's just that Matthew's usage of the terms, such as propitiation, are used with a Hebrew sense compared to Mark, which is referring to a Gentile audience.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
How many people in the early church said that he wrote in the language of the Hebrews, and how many of them said he wrote it in the rhetorical style of the Hebrews?
I would say that all of them that have mentioned the authorship of Matthew, when referring to the Hebrew, it would be referring to the Hebrew rhetoric and style, as is what he used with the Greek term that was used.
How many of them who state that use the word style and rhetoric?
That they used the word style or rhetoric, but they didn't use the word style or rhetoric because they weren't speaking English. They were utilizing a Greek term that would speak and resemble that.
So you know that I was not speaking about the English. I'm saying, what word did they use to refer to style and rhetoric? They did not use the word, the language of the Hebrews.
I'll have to get the Greek term out myself. That I don't have it necessarily in front of me.
But you are the one making the claim about the Greek, so you came on.
Correct. I have it prepared regarding at least the points that I have up, but as far as the actual Greek term that is utilized, I did not write that down. Because the only thing that I have of it, and I could put it in the private chat, would be this particular term.
The dialect, that does not refer to that refers clearly to the language. I don't see how it means rhetoric and style.
Right, the dialect would be referring to the rhetoric and the style.
The dialect of the Hebrews does not necessitate it means the rhetoric and the style.
Okay.
Do you have a qualification for that claim then?
I would think that it would be referring to indeed a rhetorical style, just like in a similar way that it's not a different language when we're dealing with the different types of kirat regarding that. I don't think it's different Arabic, or not different. They are in Arabic, but the point is that there's still the Arabic language, but there's a different style that's being utilized, not an entirely different language. And so in the same way, I see that within the Greek with the term that is used, as scholars have pointed out, that the term refers to a difference within style within the Greek language, but it's in reference to the Hebrew that is being used. That is a Hebrew touch on it.
So it says dialect of the Hebrews, and you are aware that scholars agree that it could be Hebrew or Aramaic as an option as well, yes?
Correct, as there are scholars who agree that this is referring to a Hebrew style within the Greek language as well. And I've mentioned a couple of those by name.
Yes, and so Martin Hengel, and I do know that, what's his name? I think I could be wrong here. Richard Borkham in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses mentions that it is either Hebrew or Aramaic. Are you aware that the early church was looking for a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew?
Absolutely.
Are you aware that the textual critics were looking for Hebrew Gospel of Matthew as well?
I am very well aware of that as well.
Right.
Yes.
So then you would accept that is equally likely. It could very likely be a language of the Hebrews, correct?
I don't see it based upon the primary evidence that is found within the attestation of Papias and the others. Others may be trying to look for some actual Hebrew manuscript of some sort, but then again, there were people that are looking for all kinds of things, such as Irenaeus claiming that to refute Gnostics, Jesus had to be 50 years old, yet there is no good evidence to indicate the such.
Okay, perhaps you can help me here, right?
Sure.
When the early church was writing about possibly, so you know that Eusebius writes about this, I think Origen to some extent, Tertullian definitely does, Irenaeus, Ignatius, Clement, and Papias. We take all of those names. Do any of them explain what they mean by dialecto as you've written it here?
Do they give their own explanation of what
Do they
dialecto is?
expand, like, do they make it, does it qualify the use of the term so that you and I don't have to compete with scholastic ideas?
Not to my knowledge at the moment, no.
So is it possible then that they found no need to correct it because they were simply looking for the plain reading of the word, dialect, the language of the Hebrews?
What do you mean by no need to correct it?
Well, the only reason that the scholars, at least today, to my knowledge, understand that it does not refer to a language of the Hebrews is merely because the Volage text to the Gospel of Matthew, when retranslated into Hebrew, does not give us a Hebrew sense composition of the Gospel itself. So they plainly state that this was composed in the Greek in the first place. And that is why the scholars say that Papias was either incorrect or he meant something other than by this word. So the only way we can know that dialecto here, as written, means means style, and rhetoric can only be when we deny the first meaning in the first case. Do you agree or disagree with that reasoning?
I'm trying to understand what the reason, because I was asking what you mean by correcting, and I was trying to figure out who you were referring to. I thought you meant that the early church was trying to correct Papias, or that it seemed like now you're stating that the scholars were, which that was a given, but I'm trying to understand, like, who.
So my point simply is you have to go through multiple meanings of the word, right? You do it step by step. And as you scratch one off the list, you go to the other alternative. What is meant here? So it seems that you can only come to the conclusion it does not refer to the language of the Hebrews. It's merely because we have no manuscript and we have the Volage text not being composed in a Hebrew form. So it's only if you look at those two evidences, can you deny the plain meaning language of the Hebrews? Would you agree with that?
I would sort of agree with that, yes.
Yeah, so then the conclusion likely follows that if we take the plain meaning, which is what the early church seemed to have understood, that scholars then were looking for a gospel in Hebrew for that very reason. This is the understanding that they came with.
Okay.
And then they moved to the second meaning when the first evidence could not be found. The primary evidence. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Sort of agree.
Thank you. So we have a mutual understanding, and I like that. You are a very pleasant individual. I hope that you find me equally as pleasant, though I think unlikely.
Well, we'll see. The conversation's not over yet.
No.
So, I don't know. I may have a different opinion of me later, but who knows? I'm hoping that I can be a bit tolerable for you. So, I do want to at least then go over the issue of gospel not originally being attributed to Matthew. What is the evidence then that would suggest this?
Could we just wait 1 sec? I think Nazam wanted to ask,
Yeah, sure.
Just trying to understand your position. RC, do you believe that Matthew was originally written in Greek?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I wasn't too sure. So, what do you? So you don't believe in the Papias tradition that Matthew wrote in Hebrew?
I do, but I believe we have a difference of opinion regarding that, and hence why I don't think the more of the conversation on that between me and Ijaz would be able to be beneficial for us, since he stated some things I'm definitely going to have to look more into. So
okay, fair enough. Yeah. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
What else did you think of the discussion so far?
Who said that?
Nazam.
So it's Naz.
I don't know why my eyes are going off place. I think you're talking about the conversation with us, or as a whole in general.
Today's stream.
Well, I think the interactions with the Canadian Catholic were certainly problematic and inconsistent. I think that was that.
He was inconsistent, wasn't he?
Yeah. So,
are you an Orthodox Christian, RC?
I would consider myself such in the sense that I do not affirm heretical doctrines. So I would not be a Roman Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox. I would be a Protestant, specifically from the Reformed tradition.
Yeah, because the term RC apologist is going to confuse a lot of people.
Yeah, I thought it was Roman Catholic.
Yeah, so it's Reformed Christian apologist, right?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. I see. Interesting.
Yeah, it's either Roman Catholic or talking about R.C. Sproul is usually what I get confused with the R.C. for.
So you said something earlier. Sorry, you said do you believe the author of Matthew was a disciple of Jesus?
Yes, I believe it was Matthew himself, the disciple of Jesus. Yes.
Okay.
He wrote the Gospel of Matthew. The disciple.
It was the
of
walking,
Jesus,
talking disciple of Jesus who wrote the Gospel of Matthew.
Yes, that would be who I would affirm is the author.
Why do you believe that?
I believe that based off of the attestation of the authorship of it through the church fathers, through the manuscripts that ascribe that particular name from a very early period, especially within the 2nd century, as well as, like I mentioned, within the certain Jewish context that is utilized within it, of the terms that are used, this help further identifies the person who is described within the Gospels of Matthew.
What do you think of Matthew's usage of Mark's Gospel? Do you think he
Not
treats
much.
it fairly, or do you
Yes.
think that he radically changes Mark?
I think he would only practically change it for, like I said, there's the fact that they use 2 different types of terms when it comes to the utilization of it. Like, for example, I forget what Mark uses, but I know in Matthew he uses the term propitiation and expiation regarding the issue of atonement, which are specifically Jewish types of terms, whereas Mark doesn't necessarily utilize that from my recollection. And I think that, he's fair in using that while, utilizing his own style and language. I think that's the same thing we see in the Torah with the interaction of the flood narratives from the different ancient Near Eastern worlds, that they utilize that, but at the same time, it is still part of God-inspired scripture while they are borrowing and utilizing other ancient Near Eastern flood accounts.
Can I ask you something? Sorry again. Sure. Is it a problem for you if the author of Matthew wasn't the disciple of Jesus?
Is it a problem for me if he wasn't the disciple of Jesus?
Yeah.
Not necessarily, because the way that I have a view of the issue of canon and a tri-perspectival argumentation, as John Frame notes, is that essentially we have it being from a disciple or prophet, or is from someone who knew the prophet or disciples. Hence why some of the prophets in the Old Testament, some of their works weren't written by themselves necessarily, but by people who were their scribes or their friends and associates.
Okay, so if the author of Matthew is not disciple of Jesus, that means we don't know who the author is then, isn't it? If it's not.
Mm-hmm. Correct, if it's not.
Right. So then how can you be sure that they are recording accurate history?
Because they are recording accurate history in light of what the Gospels themselves have as the particular name of it. It has those names attributed on them from a very early part in almost every manuscript that we have, especially up to the 2nd century.
1 second. Let me just interject here.
Just.
Can you hear me? I'll see.
Yeah, sure.
It's just fun. It's just a bit strange calling you that because you're not Roman Catholic. I just got to get it out of my system, right? I'm going to be confused half the time.
Right.
Is my voice clear because I tend to speak softly?
Understandable.
Okay, perfect. Do you have a name that you want me to call you by? Like, even if it's a pseudonym, just something easy.
RCA, Reformed Christian Apologist, Reformed or Apologist, whatever you want to call me.
Could I call you Up? What does that mean? Because RC is difficult for me. But just quickly, work with me here. You said, what was your statement on, so just to be clear, you have Papias or Papias, however you pronounce it. So,
Right.
Then you have Irenaeus. I don't think you have Ignatius. And you have Eusebius, possibly Origen. I'm not too certain on that one. You will have about 3 early attestations. Would that be correct?
I said I don't even know if Eusebius
Yeah,
names it, because I think whenever Eusebius does do it, he's quoting Papias for that part. So that would still just necessarily just go straight down to Papias and not necessarily be Eusebius. But as far as besides Irenaeus, I believe there are 2 others that would mention the authorship of the Gospel of Matthew. And I'm going to try to see if I can figure out who their names is, because I think it's one of the Clements, but I could be wrong on that.
I don't think Clement's letter mentions Matthew by name, but he quotes what is later known to be the Gospel of Matthew. I know that specifically because I reviewed a video with another Christian apologist on that. I could be wrong. If you find it, do correct me.
Okay, yes, it's from the Endombelinus in Epistolas Canonicus on 1 Peter 5:13. He mentions the Gospels with the genealogies came first. Mark's was done by request of Peter's preaching in Rome.
What is the name?
John came last with the urging of friends. It's a Latin term, so pardon me if I butcher it. Dumbrationes in Epistolas Canonicus on 1 Peter 5:13.
That would not be within the 2nd century, correct? That would be, I think that would be the 4th century, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it's from Clement of Alexandria, so I don't know if that would be, I believe, 180 AD. At least that's what the data I have on my thing is stating regarding Clement of Alexandria.
I think that may be incorrect, but I could be wrong there. So, okay, you have Clement, possibly, and you have Papias. Those two, and then you have Irenaeus, contemporaneous to Clement.
And then we have Tertullian as well, and against Marcion.
Okay, all right. So, but I think Tertullian would be writing in the early 3rd century, late 2nd century, correct?
Correct.
So, how many of these people would be within the 1st century, given that statement of attribution?
Regarding these people being born or living during the 1st century, I don't think
first-hand knowledge. So, none of them would be at that time, basically.
Correct.
So this would generally be a later reattribution to Matthew as opposed to contemporaneous or within living memory of someone knowing Matthew himself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then we can slightly agree then that this is later rather than earlier in the context of things. I want to add to this. You mentioned something about the manuscripts. What was your statement on your manuscripts about them having the names?
That they had the names in the manuscript that we do have, where the title area would be, as well as from what I had read, that they have some sort of a citation footnote or something within a corner that would label what it would be called. So
I would point out that there are 2 manuscripts here which may be able to illuminate this conversation. The first is P1, which on the recto just has the letter alpha, and on the verso has a later titular attribution, but that seems to be by a later author. So P1 does not have a title for the Gospel of Matthew, either as an inscriptio or as a subscriptio, but the inscriptio in this case would be the first page. The only other one I know of that is early would be P4, and that would be the flyleaf fragment. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that terminology. That itself, the dating goes from the late 2nd century to the mid 4th century. I can cite Dr. Brent Nongbury in his book God's Library on this. He references Shield, who is the one who purchased the manuscript himself in 1890. He references Dr. Hunt, and he references Dr. Frederick Kenyon, if I'm not mistaken. So generally, I don't think it is as early as I think in the 2nd century. I could be wrong. You're free to correct me, but I do not think, I think P1 is contemporaneous to P4, given the dates I've just mentioned and the scholars.
Well, there is the citation in Timothy Paul Jones' response to Bart Ehrman called Misquoting Truth on page 98, where he says, quote, in the 2nd century papyri P64 and in 2 5th century codices known as Codex Bezae and Codex Washingtonus, point is that there is P64, which is the 2nd century. The title of the first New Testament gospel is Gospel According to Matthew.
So I will just put a correction there, because P4, P64, and P67 allegedly belong to the same codex. The reason for that is that when Shield bought it, it was within a codex of Philo. The problem here, however, as noted by later paleographers, including Dr. Nongbury, is that the writing for the Gospel of Matthew does not match the other manuscripts found in Oxford and Barcelona as their house today. So plainly on the surface level, they don't refer to the same thing. This reference that you're giving me, how recent is it? Because I don't think it engages with the most recent scholarship, which will be within the last 10 years, Dr. Nongbury's book being 2 years ago.
Well, this was resurrecting with Bart Ehrman's book as it was released. So this is in reference to shortly a bit after the time that Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus came out, since the book is a interaction with and response to Misquoting Jesus. It's called Misquoting Truth.
So to be clear here, P4 actually does not say Evangelion Katomation. It only says Katomation. So I'm not sure, unless this person is saying that P64 separately of P4 gives that title, but I don't think that's the case, because P64 would primarily be the Gospel according to Luke. Do you have any other manuscript evidence that you wanted to go through? And the references for this are in Dr. Brent Nongbu's book, God's Library, published, I think, 2 years ago.
I would say that regarding the manuscript evidence, I don't have any others, just that I'm still also at the same time looking for the evidence to demonstrate that originally they had no attribution of who the author was behind this particular gospel.
And originally, I think I pointed out that P1 has no title. I want to point out here as well that that dating for the 3rd century is incorrect. I'll tell you why. That is because when it was purchased, the idea was because it came from a city called Coptos, which was presumably destroyed in the year 292. That is where that dating, the terminus antiquem, the upper limit, comes from. From what we know, Coptos as a city thrived into the 9th and 10th centuries. So that upper limit cannot be discarded largely. What we can say is that the upper limit, just on the paleography of it, seems to indicate sense composition indicators. I think the word is ekthesis in Greek, and consequent from that, there is another term, stikoi, which demonstrate actual paragraphs. So that would put it firmly beyond the 4th century, although I think Dr. Nombre agrees mid-4th century is the terminus antiquem. I could be wrong, but I think that's what he says. If you want, I can bring up the page numbers for you, and God willing, I can share it with you if you want. Just to be clear, I'm not speaking down to you. I like engaging with you, and I do enjoy it. So please don't take anything I've said as offensive.
I'm not, honestly. The only thing I really need to worry about is the swollen ulnar nerve I got going on in my left arm right now. So this is the least of my worries.
You're in the best place because we got a doctor on the panel. You see that guy above me, Dr. Imran?
Just take your elbow off the desk, brother. You'll be fine.
I'm not joking. He's an actual medical doctor. We're a one-stop shop. Textual criticism, church history, and a medical doctor.
I help with resuscitations afterwards.
Just to point out the name, so it's God's Library, page 268 onwards.
Okay,
so
I'll have to look that one up.
No problem. Did you have any additional points, Brother App or RC Apologist?
Before I do, I would like to ask, I believe Jordan's the one that's in charge of the thing, if how much time did I have left? Because I do know y'all said y'all would restricting yourself to 10 minutes.
Well, we like you, so I would hope that we can continue.
I think definitely. I like enjoying this conversation a lot, so definitely we'll see it out. I guess there's one other person waiting, and it looks like the same guy that we kicked before, but in disguise. So I know he's
he's not the smartest man in the world.
Not disguise.
It's just a forehead with sunglasses this time, but I recognise
that is the guy.
And his name's Matthew. His name's Matthew today.
So what's the issue with? Because I noticed that earlier.
Oh, I know him from another show where he is very offensive. He's insulting, he's demeaning. He calls people pedophiles and he makes general insults. And the nature of this program is we want respectable people like yourself to have a conversation with.
And is
people
this person
like him.
claiming to be a Christian?
Yeah, he says actually that he's allowed to speak this way because he's speaking to the Antichrist, that is Muslims. I think he's commenting in the chat.
Well, Jesus and the Apostle Paul both condemn that kind of thing and says that if you act like that, that's pretty much living in sin and would be at risk of sending yourself to hell at that point. So
Jacob, I hope you hear
that. So I would plead that the person repents of this attitude.
Sorry, RC, do you have the reference to the scripture passages? Because
if you're referring, in reference to 1 Peter 3:15, there's be one that says to be gentle and in kindness, and then there's also the issue of Colossians 2:9, which let me pull it up. No, wait, actually not Colossians 2. There was a passage that basically says to not use corrupt communication, do not use filthy language or filthy communication. These terms that are utilized, at least from what I observed in my video, that I leased out the definitions provided by the Greek scholars and everything, they all state that this does indeed refer to a modern equivalent of profane cussing, essentially. Basically anything that shuts down the communication. It's not just cussing, but pretty much trying to utilize insults at that point.
So just go back to the original
Matthew's gospel says
right.
your neighbor as well.
Right.
Since
So
we're speaking about Matthew today, so yeah.
So I just want to get back to the point you said where you believe that Matthew is the author.
Yes.
After Ijaz came with his response to that, do you still believe he's the author?
Yes, because ultimately, like I would affirm elsewhere, is that I think the main thing we're definitely going to be having that cause us to interpret the evidence differently is the matter of worldviews, that we have our different worldviews and perspectives on this. And so when I look at the data, that I do see that the collective testimony and evidence of this, especially of the brothers and sisters in Christ that have attested to this throughout church history, that we can affirm that this is indeed by Matthew, and I don't see any reason to suggest that it's otherwise.
New Testament scholars like J.B. Phillips, they said it's anonymous. So I'm trying to understand how New Testament scholars say it's anonymous, and then you're so sure it's a disciple of Jesus.
Right, and my whole thing does not depend upon necessarily relying on New Testament scholars, because scholars.
No, I get that. So why do they believe it's anonymous and you don't? I'm just trying to understand that.
And again, like I said, the issue would be a matter of worldviews. They have a different worldview than probably what I would hold to regarding certain issues, even from within the claims of Christianity. Because some people say, I am a Christian, and no lie, I've actually met someone that says this. I am a Christian, and I believe in Christianity, but I don't think Jesus actually existed. Like, I've met people that actually state these kinds of things. So again, it's a matter of worldviews.
Okay, but we obviously, the author of Matthew doesn't say his name's Matthew, does he?
Correct, and not a lot of other people do.
Forget that. Just say the author of Matthew doesn't say his name's Matthew, does he? No.
Regarding what, with like in the actual text itself?
Saying that he's the author, yeah.
I would say not in the text itself, no.
And obviously the birth of Jesus, Matthew wasn't there, was he?
No.
So who's recording that?
That would be Matthew.
Matthew wasn't there.
And neither was Luke, but we know that he was recording.
How did Matthew record the birth of Jesus when Matthew wasn't there?
Because he is gathering his information.
From who?
He doesn't reveal the sources, unlike Luke.
Okay, so you believe Matthew went to the shepherds and I don't know, the Magi?
I don't know who he went to.
Well, you believe he did, isn't it?
I don't believe he went to a specific person that I know by name. I believe he went to somebody.
Why do you believe that, though? Why do you believe that?
Because I believe that based off of how we see Luke examines this, and if he's able to do that in that particular culture, exactly. And so, if Luke can do that, Matthew likewise.
Hold
on. But I'm not presuming. I'm merely going based off of something that is a common thing within that particular culture. If one is doing historical inquiry, and for writing a book,
so you believe Luke did that?
Yes, he even identifies and says that he gathered his.
Okay, and how long after Jesus leaving this earth did he write his book, Luke, or he write his manuscript, Luke?
Let me take a look here. I don't have the number.
According to your kind of version of Christianity that you're holding on to.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's a normal Christian, just to be clear. I
don't know. It's got a kind of KJV only kind of flex going on.
Not really. I actually debate King James only. So
fantastic.
So do I. I guess we have more in common than we thought.
So, as far as the dating composition of it, concerning this is from Robert J. Cara's introduction on it in the Biblical Theological Introduction to the New Testament. Says, concerning the dating of the Gospel of Luke, given that I hold that Luke, the physician, is the author, I place the date in the AD 50s or early 60s. This is based primarily on Luke's having also written Acts and the assumption that Acts was written before Paul died.
Right,
and then he mentions the note about critical scholars as well, but that's another point.
Is that about 20, 30 years later?
About give or take, so yes.
Yeah, and then when Luke went and did his investigation, he went to find witnesses to find out what happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Repeat that again?
You believe that when Luke wrote his gospel, that he interviewed eyewitnesses from 30 years who were there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And you believe, and how can you be sure that that eyewitness testimony was accurate?
Based on the fact that he is naming these people in reference, and whenever he does that, he puts himself at a risk at that point. Because
so who did he ask?
I don't have the names off the top of my head, but there are points where he mentions people's names. Like I think he mentions the person by name of who helped Jesus carry his cross. And whenever you mention something like that, you're eventually going to have people wondering about this. And if that person's alive, they're going to go ask that person or their relatives to help confirm these stories. And if he was lying or making it up, he would have been easily busted and refuted at that point during the time that it was released.
I've set the place for you. Go on, you go for it.
Okay, so I just want to go back a little bit, right? When you spoke of the name, was there any other evidence that you think prove your case that would sway us in that direction, as opposed to everything that we've already mentioned?
I think that I would have the evidence, but I think the main issue, in order for it to be persuasive to the point, is again an issue of worldviews. I think that we're all looking at the same exact evidence, but because of our worldviews and our presuppositions, that we're going to interpret the evidence differently because of that.
That's not fair.
One sec, Hamza. One sec. So when you read the Gospel of Matthew, for example, do you read into that John 14:26 that the disciples will be remembered everything that Jesus said and did? Do you read that into the authorship of Matthew?
So regarding John 14:26.
Yeah, that they would be reminded of what Jesus said and did, of all things that Jesus said and did. Would you read that belief into your belief that Matthew wrote that gospel? That is not strictly from a historical inquiry, but also a revelatory inquiry as well.
Well, I believe everything is revelatory at that point. I mean, I believe in general revelation and special revelation, but I do believe that indeed Matthew was inspired by God to write God-inspired scripture in the Gospel of Matthew. Yes.
So why do you believe that?
So, one second, Hamza. So then, in other words, your view is not strictly on the historicity. Your view is premised also on a theological point of view.
Yeah, exactly.
Correct.
Okay.
So I think what Hamza was trying to get at was, is this purely a historical inquiry for you like it is for us? Or is it something more so like theological? Because as a Muslim, I would have no problem accepting that you believe it was revealed by God in some capacity. I know that when we use the word reveal, Muslims and Christians, we disagree by what we mean by that.
Right.
But generally speaking, your worldview is informed by the fact that this has to be scripture. So you can't accept a tradition that says it isn't scripture, just to be clear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so even if we presented extra evidence, you would still say to me, your theology comes first in this case, regardless of the historical evidence?
Right, because that would be by nature what happens. Everyone has a presupposition whenever they begin to look at something. There is no neutrality when examining issues of history, of science, of mathematics, or logic.
Well, I believe we have been neutral.
Well, you would be arguing from the Islamic worldview, and rightly so, regarding the issues of what y'all are bringing forth and what is the case that is to be presented.
No, we're not doing that. We're not doing that.
Just to be clear, RC, we try not to bring Islam into our discussions of historicity. Very recently, I had a debate on the historicity of the crucifixion. That's clearly Islamic, I get that. But in my opening statement, I laid out how we employ the historical method. I'm sure you will agree that we can't all be fully unbiased. Our bias comes in somewhere along the way. But generally, I think you and I can generally end this conversation at this point because we agree to disagree. We agree that the way that we would interpret the evidence does not change. And I think we would agree as well, because your worldview reads into, at this point, that God inspired it, then there's nothing that we can do to change that. Right?
Because we're not arguing it. We could argue against that particular point, but we're not. We're not arguing against theology.
We're trying not to make a theological
debate for the history. But
well,
thank you for coming on.
Much
appreciated.
All right.
Thank you, RC, for coming on. Hope to see you soon on Twitter. God willing.
Thanks a lot, RC. I enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that. So
it was very pleasant.
Thanks, RC.
You could see that theme. You could see that theme. It was theological.
Yeah. So this is the point, really, because ultimately, with all the knowledge, mashallah, I mean, I have to say RC was very good in the sense that he had a lot of background, but ultimately for him that didn't matter.
No.
What mattered was what he said was his worldview, so his theological position. And I think then I'm getting although I'm not accusing him of this, but if there's no evidence that could get you to change your mind about anything, then that becomes sort of a blind following.
Completely.
And blind faith. And I think we're trying to sort of approach it from a historical perspective.
Just to be clear, I did ask him the question: if evidence came out that contravened your position, would you accept it with an exception to your theology? And he said no.
Oh, no.
So it's a purely theological view that he holds on to, and we can't blame him for that. But the discussion is not about theology, unfortunately, today. But God willing, we can have a theological discussion, and we are open to that. I think Hamza is open to that.
Is your mate there with a crash helmet on now?
Still there. He's got sunglasses and just the forehead. But
I find it funny because one day he came onto Brother Kenny Bowmer's stream, right? And I'm going to give us, this is story time now. I know we were long on time, but let me give the story just to lighten the mood a bit. He comes on 1 week and he shows his nose go down. And then the next week he comes with his nose go up. And he's arguing, you will never know what my face looks like. And I had to remind him, all we have to do. So he doesn't think too far ahead. And, his name is Jacob. And, Jacob, I want to let you know that we love you insofar as we want you to come to the truth of God. But your demeanor and your behavior, as RC Apologist mentioned, would not be Christ-like. And so because he agreed with us, we have no choice but to go with the consensus. And sorry, but you will not be able to come on the stream today.
Yeah.
Perhaps it is.
His message is that you're scared. But we have
I am shaking. I'm terrified, let me tell you, as I calmly sip this water.
So should we bring the next one in, or do you want to have a brief discussion on what just took place?
Bring the next one. Bring the next one in.
So we have Sir Stanley Matthews.
That's the same guy. That's the same guy.
He's got two to this guy. All right.
That's the same guy.
So yeah, you couldn't tell what You couldn't tell who that was. Well, that's all we have then, I'm afraid.
Jordan, the name is Matthew twice. Come on.
We just got loads of him in the back.
Hold on. So Stanley says he's not the guy. So let's bring him back. Let's give him. Yeah. Stanley, can you put on your?
Hello, guys.
All
right.
That's not Jacob. Okay.
Yes. Welcome.
Are we all keeping safe from coronavirus?
Yeah. Thanks for waiting. You've been there a while, patiently. But yeah, you a Christian?
I am. It's Sam, by the way, guys. I hope you're all keeping well.
Oh, Sam.
Thank you.
Genuinely, my family got hit.
I should see this. Stanley Matthews, Stoke. Sam.
Yeah, Sam Ison. No, it's nice to see you're all in good health, actually, because the coronavirus is a real thing, isn't it? So, my family got hit by it, so I hope you're all. These days, mate. I've just come for just one point, and it's about the Herod one. Who brought up Herod, by the way? Was it you, Darren, or was it Ijaz?
Both of us.
Or was it both of you? Can one of you recap just quickly, just so I don't straw man you or anything like that?
You tell us what you thought we said, and you responded to it.
Fair enough. So it was you were on about the historical record of Herod, correct? In terms of it wasn't kept, the fact that it was sent out to kill like the 2-year-old, 2 and unders, yeah.
Go on,
you said it was.
Make your point.
So, okie dokie. So basically, it's the idea, or from what I heard, was that these people were sent, or the soldiers were sent, out to like neighboring villages and such. I've understood they were sent to Bethlehem specifically to find Jesus. Would you disagree with that?
Just make your point.
I would disagree with that.
Just let him make the point, though, Ijaz. Let him make the point.
Where's my Bible?
Because I guess in the Bible I've got in front of me, it references Bethlehem, especially.
Okay,
it's an NIV, admittedly.
What's the point you're making?
No, just saying that if it was just to find one individual, rather than an atrocity where lots of people were killed, why would that be kept as a record?
Was it? So you don't believe there was a killing of all children under the age of 2?
Not that from what I've been able to find at the moment.
What does it say in the Gospel of Matthew?
I'll admit that.
What does it say in the Gospel of Matthew?
From what I can gather so far, so the wise men go and visit Herod, and they inform him of Jesus's birth and say that he's in Bethlehem. Sorry, go on, Ijaz.
Could I read for you the verse, because it provides context?
Yeah, no, go for it, mate.
So go for it. It says in Matthew chapter 2, verse where is it? Chapter 2, verse 16. When Herod saw, I'm reading from the NET. When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he became enraged. He sent men to kill all the children in Bethlehem and throughout the surrounding region. So I think that answers the question.
Which verse? Sorry, Ijaz?
16,
I didn't catch the verse.
Chapter 2, verse 16. I'm reading from the NET, New Translation.
Here we go.
In the NIV, it says, when Herod realized he'd been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi.
Found it. Perfect.
So how many children do you think are aged between newborn and 2?
Say again, sorry, Darren.
How many babies do you think are born in 2 years? in Bethlehem and its surrounding villages?
I imagine not many. It'd probably be like 2 to 3.
In 2 years?
What?
Oh, in 2 years. Sorry, I thought you said in 1 year. Sorry, my headphones are not the best.
So
You'll have
just let me say
to
this again.
excuse me.
In Bethlehem and its surrounding villages, even 1 year, you think only 3 children were born?
No, I thought you just meant Bethlehem on its own. I'm not sure, really. I guess it was a random guess. Could be, I don't know, probably 100 or so.
102
That would
years.
be my.
In Bethlehem and
that
its
would be a
surrounding villages. How many people lived in Bethlehem?
A couple thousand.
I'm not gonna claim that I know, my friend.
But you just said only 2 or 3 in 2 years.
I actually didn't hear your time scale. Sorry, my headphones are not doing me any
if
favors.
the age of the children is 0 to 2, the clue is in 0 to 2, isn't it? So Herod is killing any child that's 2 years and under. So don't you think that would have been recorded?
I guess it should have been recorded somewhere.
Thank you, Sam.
However,
what?
It's like, was it? Oh, sorry, I've never been the best at getting my words out.
That's okay. Take your time.
May I ask for the quick reference of the book you referred to? Was it you referred to it, Darren, or was it Ijaz? I know it was one of you two. What book was it?
One of the books by Josephus.
The book. That's the one.
Yeah.
I said this. Josephus was specifically writing about the atrocities that King Herod committed. Yet he doesn't mention this. And your excuse that he doesn't mention it because it was only 2 or 3 kids in a 2-year period.
I honestly didn't hear your time period, your question properly. Sorry, Dan. My headphones were not the best.
But the child has to be between 0 and 2. In Bethlehem and its surrounding villages.
I do want to point out here, even if you didn't hear the time scale, I think
let me address the audio second, guys.
Okay, give him a second. Let's be fair. But I would like to say that at least the conversations today have been considerably more pleasant than in previous streams. I think what has happened is the riffraff we've dealt with, and so the more educated people come on, and they're more able to have a less emotional and a more intellectual discussion, which is what we want at the end of the day. So I applaud these guys for coming on and being pleasant. This tells us this is what we want, basically. Good, pleasant discussions.
So Sam, do you accept you're wrong now? Now you realize the timescale.
I'm not sure if he hears you.
I think you may have adjusted the audio too much, maybe.
Maybe.
We have next in the chat. We have is one Colossians. Is that Stefan?
Oh
God.
Listen.
just when you spoke too soon, Ijaz, I think that you just.
I think I said his name and he got the idea to come on. What we can do at this point is we've reached 2 hours. Can we come to a consensus on how much longer you guys intend to go?
I think it's going to be 2 or 3 streams, guys. So I think maybe 2 hours is probably a limit.
Next stream, no problem.
All right, so we'll guarantee Stefan come on to the next one.
So before we leave, I just want to respond to a video that was made in response to EFDawah. And I'm not going to say the person's name, but if you purchase toilet paper, he calls himself a boy. So let me be clear here. You guys got that, yeah? Toilet paper and boy.
Yes.
Okay. It's not a mathematical equation, right, guys? As Jason would say. Said his name, I'm going to hell now.
The angry pastor.
You must not be named.
Oh, you give it away.
Damn it! I gotta quit EFDawah now. So I've come to realize that a lot of these people that make responses to EFDawah, the streams that we've done, they do 19-minute videos, and they all repeat themselves for that entire 19 minutes. So in less than 1 minute, I'm going to deconstruct the 4 points that he brought up. So in the first place, he said that Ijaz, I depend on argumentum ad ignorantium in my debates with people. That is, I appeal to the ignorance of others. That is not the case. Why? He mentioned Jonathan McClatchy as one example, Dr. Jonathan McClatchy. In my discussion with Dr. Jonathan McClatchy, you would understand the way that logic works is when you make a claim, you must qualify it to prove your claim. That is how deductive logic works. You make X claim, you follow it with a reason. You make Y claim, you follow it with a proof. And then that leads necessarily to a standard conclusion. That is not the case here. Why? Because when I spoke with Jonathan, he made a claim and he could not qualify it. In response to him, what I did was I cited an evidence. I cited Codex Washingtonianus, and I gave the verse in which it mentions what the statement I made was. So my claim was based on evidence. His claim was not based on evidence. Therefore, I am not appealing to his ignorance. I am appealing to my evidence. So fundamentally, Toilet Paperboy, you don't understand how logic works. In the second case, he played a clip where I paused and I asked my interlocutor at that debate, Stephen Atkins, to clarify a question he had asked me. Toilet Paperboy said because I paused to ask him a question, I was stuttering. No, pausing to think is not something negative. I rather answer a question honestly than answer immediately and respond to the wrong question. So I want you to understand here, his criticism of me is that I pause to think, clarify, and then answer. That goes to tell you what his apologetics is like. That involves no thinking or no pause of thought. If the debate is won or lost on a person pausing to speak, then I think I won that debate because you only showed one clip of me pausing. How many times did the other guy pause? But that's not a problem. That's not a claim that Muslims make. In the third case, he said, look how Ijaz does history. He goes to the Calling Christians Facebook page and he shows a picture very craftily of me quoting a reverend. And he says, look, Ijaz does history by quoting a reverend. Well, see, I would be wrong, but when was that post made? 6 years ago. That was made in 2014. We were in 2020. I was not as educated as I was back then. But I realized when I went to the post, who was this reverend I was quoting? He studied the history of religion at the Yale University. So I wasn't quoting some guy who is a reverend who got his degree off of the internet, right? He studied at an educational institution, one of the topmost institutions in the world, and he's writing from a theological perspective, and it is quite valid to cite him. Further, pursuant in that regard, I gave 5 other academic citations 6 years ago. 5. You will notice he only showed one for the reverend, 1, because he did not fact check who the reverend was, and 2, he did not want to show the other references made. So again, this is the shoddy scholarship. I respond to all your points. I'm not responding to part of your point. Thirdly, there was something else he mentioned. I'm trying to remember his last point. It may have slipped my mind, but God knows best. At the end of the day, if you're going to make 19-minute refutations, then you need to, 1, understand how logic works in the first place. You need to understand how citations work. You need to understand how evidence is used in argumentation. So while I enjoyed your 19-minute video, it was highly entertaining, the one thing it lacked was any educational interest from me. So God willing, if you do choose to respond again, unlikely you have to, God willing, you elevate your level of understanding. Otherwise, you're just wasting our time. Would one of you like to summarize the stream, and God willing, we can pick up next week? Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address that individual.
Sure. Yeah, I think for me, I personally see a lot of the refutation videos, and isn't it quite? Because I think quite kind responding. Isn't it a bit strange having an open panel and then watching response videos afterwards when they're welcome to just come on? So for me, I don't really understand. I don't really understand. It just looks silly to me. But
so I want to point out, we just had a conversation with RC Apologist and another lad, right? We gave them time to speak. There was pause. There was conversation. Anyone who comes and says, you know what, these guys just talk over other people, look how pleasant the previous conversations were. We are not animals where we scream and shout over each other at the park, right? We're not that lady from whatever country, Turkey, whatever it is. Right. The point is we have civility here, alhamdulillah. And people have been praising Brother Darren, Dr. Imran, Nazam. I've never heard someone say Nazam was mean to me in a conversation. I've never seen someone say Dr. Imran raised his voice at me and insulted me in a conversation. I've never seen, actually, I'm going to skip that guy. You get the point is we've all we've been kind and peaceable, and we call people to have conversations with us in a good way. So you are right, Brother Jordan, in what you said.
Hamza, you're on mute, I think.
Is he? No, he's on mute now. We can't hear you. Hamza, we can't hear you.
Shall we leave him like that?
Now you can hear me. Right. You double bluff me. No, like, for example, the RC Apologist, was it his name? Very nice, very pleasant. But the point here is this: when it came to the nitty-gritty, it collapses because it sounds really pretty. But as soon as you just ask the key questions, you realize straight away, wait a minute, you're on a different tangent to us. Because we're talking about history, you're talking about theology straight away. And you could see that that's where it was going. So I might interject sometimes, but I just need to bring it to the head. You know what I mean? Because a lot of the people in the comment section, to be honest, you don't understand the academia of it. So they need to understand, okay, you've got all the academia. What's your point? That's the whole principle. Dr. Imran, you're very, very good at summing up. I love.
I just really wanted to ask Brother Nazam if you want to add anything at all to what's been said so far.
No, you guys have been very kind, especially those on the chats. Thank you for the kind words. God, thank you for Canadian as well, Canadian Christian. Very nice as well, and RC Apologist as well.
Alhamdulillah. So Jazakallah khair for that, Nazam. I mean, I think really this has been a very good opening stream on Matthew, and really the things that have come to the fore have always been really a similar pattern to what we found for Mark. So not much early extant manuscript evidence, and what we have is very little. Nothing really names the author at all, and the authorship attribution is much later. And we talked about how this doesn't fit with the historical narrative, and the fact that people refer back to Papias, who was most likely referring to a Hebrew gospel that isn't available to us at the moment. Other than that, we found that there are lots of issues within the text itself. So we spoke about the fact that, and I'm going to try and remember these, and they won't really be in order, but we spoke about the fact that Herod, the claims about Herod trying to kill the people, the children around Bethlehem and in his area are not tenable because they're not really recorded anywhere, specifically in Josephus' recordings of the atrocities of Herod, where you'd expect to find them. And also we had a Christian who came on, Sam, who we know very well, and he said his parents had coronavirus, and we hope that they recovered and they're completely well. He even had not read the verse which clarified that actually this is referring to not just Bethlehem but the surrounding areas, and had no ideas of birth rates, which is fair enough because he's a young man. Then we had, before that we had RC Christian, and he was dealing with the point that we had raised about, again, Papias, and there was a lot of quite academic, and if I think very, very detailed information that probably was, as Hamza was saying, above many people in terms of understanding, and I had to struggle myself to keep up with that. But it's impressive to know that when you really get down to the bottom, his final really answer to that, and I hope not to sort of mischaracterize him, was that he had a worldview. So this was a theological position he held, and evidence ultimately didn't matter. And really what we're doing here is, what is the evidence that you have for your books that you claim that are revelation? And there is none for that. Before that, we had RC Christian, who was dealing with two previous points that we'd raised. So one was the point about Emmanuel, and how this was, Jesus would never call this, and how this is, therefore unlikely to have been attributed to him, and was put in just to fulfill an Old Testament prophecy. Again, he used the word presumably, and he used this quite a lot. And prior to that, we spoke about, what was the thing that we spoke about? About Yahweh being someone who revealed to the Magi that they can come and worship Jesus, and he'll put a star there. And again, there was lots of presumablies and almost admissions of Yahweh giving revelation to pagan nations in the past that are not mentioned anywhere at all. Again, a lot of conjecture. And so I think that really an interesting stream. Jazakallah khair to the brothers, Jazakallah khair for all your contributions and your knowledge. May Allah increase you all. Ameen. And I think we would like to have more Christians of the same caliber or better to come on, because really what we're trying to do, although sometimes it can be heated, really we're trying to engage on a neutral level, in the sense that we're not making a theological position. We respect people's theological positions. We're trying to talk about the historical evidence, and that's where we'd like to go. Jazakallah khair, everyone. I wish you all the best.
Can I just say one thing before you wrap?
Yeah, sure.
Just an idea about the next stream that I think would be really, really good.
Yeah.
We're going to go into the claims in Matthew, because one thing, like I said right at the very beginning, the one thing that supports this idea of Matthew being a disciple and all this, he loves to quote the Old Testament. So what I'd like to do is go through Matthew where he quotes the Old Testament, and we'll demonstrate he doesn't know what he's talking about. And then you Christians need to ask yourself, couple of questions, and even the theology will come in now. First of all, if Matthew keeps messing up when he tries to quote Old Testament, does he know what he's talking about? First of all, second thing, if he's inspired by a God, would he make those mistakes? So we're not doing the theology, but we knock out the theology without even addressing it. Because if the author of Matthew is deliberately agenda-driven, trying to force a narrative using Old Testament prophecy butchered and taken out of context and even fabricated, then that is not Holy Spirit inspiration. That is a man with an agenda. So I think we should, because I've read the book by the late Gerald, may Allah be pleased with him. And I'd like to bring some of his points to the fore.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think that's something really good we can get our teeth into in the next stream. Sorry, Ijaz, go on.
I just wanted to thank Muhammad Mesto for donating. May Allah reward him. As you guys know, at this time, the world is in chaos and funds are not as free as they previously were, but the Dawah work continues regardless. So it is helpful when we get donations. It helps us get new works. It helps us do these streams. So I do encourage, if you have the ability, do give for the sake of Allah. I just want to read out Brother Muhammad's message because it is a lovely message. And perhaps it is we can end the stream after that. He says, MashaAllah, a mixture of beautiful personalities. I guess he forgot that I was on the panel. He said, and a combination of proper knowledge and good Islamic manners from the brothers. Alhamdulillah. He continues, keep it up, and may Allah accept your work and make you from his favorites.
Ameen.
Ameen. And can I just say special shout out to Brother Said. He wants to know when is the next time I will turn up on time to a Muslim Christian meeting. So next week, inshallah.
Yeah. So part 2 of this is going to be next Sunday, same time, I believe.
Sunday, 10 o'clock.
Tomorrow there's a stream, isn't there? With I think Abdurrahim Green's coming on.
Yeah, it's Islam Green. So we get the beautiful words of Abbas along with Abdurrahim Green. That'll be it. Don't miss out on that one. I think it's tomorrow at 10 o'clock as well. So
and just a quick shout out to our subscribers. Jordan M, as modest as he is, he has his own channel and he has beautiful content on it. Brothers, please go to his channel and subscribe. And Brother Ben Ikra, again, completely unique material find on his channel. Please go to his channel and subscribe. And then, of course, Sammy Kuhn, our brother Chris, who's got his Come to Success YouTube channel. Support the brothers, mashallah, because even though we do what we do, they've still got their own little unique flexes going on. And if you can support them just by subscribing and sharing their work, alhamdulillah, it'd be fantastic. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome, everyone.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.